The next set for the Pokemon TCG Lost Origin is almost here, guys, and today I'm going to give you my full set review to get you caught up to speed on all of the most promising new cards that we're about to be getting. But for me, what makes Lost Origin such a special set is the fact that this marks the grand return of the Lost Zone mechanic that has been on a 3-year hiatus at this point, coming back into the game. And for those unaware, the Lost Zone, it kind of functions as a more permanent version of your discard pile, but you can't actually access it or get cards out of it. But several of the most important new cards in the set, such as the new Giratina VSTAR, Mirage Gate, and others, have very powerful effects that are directly tied to this mechanic. And if you guys happen to be just as stoked about these new Lost Zone cards as I am, just a heads up, friends of the channel over at flipsidegaming.com are still taking pre-orders on sealed product. You can use that coupon code RARECANDY at checkout to get 10% off your order and free shipping. And to make things even better, all of Rare Candy's patrons have their own exclusive code for an even bigger discount. But if Flipside is out of stock by the time you see this video, I also do have an affiliate link with TCG Player that will still help you find the next cheapest price elsewhere online. Links to everything will be down below in the description today. But getting back into today's video, as always, these Sword and Shield sets have been massive, and to make things easier on you guys, I have timestamps pinned to the top of the comments section. That way it's easier on you to jump to any card that you might want to hear about in today's set review. But with all that out the way, sit back, get comfortable, remember to leave a like on the video to feed the YouTube algorithm, and let's jump in and check out what Lost Origin has in store for us. So we're going to kick things off with a brand new Vileplume card. So of course, Vileplume is a stage 2 Pokemon. This one has 2 attacks. The first one for a grass and colorless does 50, and you heal 30 from this Pokemon. Nothing too fancy there, but the second attack, definitely a little bit more attention grabbing. For a grass and 2 colorless, does 90, and you flip a coin. If heads, your opponent can't play any supporter cards from their hand during their next turn. But if tails, your opponent can't play any item cards from their hand during their next turn. So even though this is a coin flip attack, which normally would be really bad, you're guaranteed a very disruptive effect no matter the outcome here. But of course, if you do want a particular outcome, of course, we do have Glimwood Tangle still in the format to maybe allow you to reflip some coins from time to time. But both effects on their own, pretty powerful. So if you do wind up locking your opponent's item cards, there's a lot of really powerful cards that is going to turn off. So think of things like Quick Ball and Ultra Ball that most decks are very reliant on to get their decks set up pretty quickly. And in the case of supported lock, if your opponent doesn't have a lot of strong item or ability based ways of drawing cards, this is really going to bring their deck to a screeching halt. So even though I do think this attack kind of in a vacuum seems really strong, there's definitely some issues that we have here with this card. First of all, the card is a stage 2. That's going to be sort of the big elephant in the room here. Attacking stage 2 decks are notoriously inconsistent, very difficult to stream these attackers throughout the course of a game. And especially if your opponent is ever to finally set up an attacker and knock out a Vileplume, if you don't have another one ready to go and that lock is broken, it's going to be very difficult to actually come back from that. And I think the other big issue has to be this damage output. 90 is just not a whole lot of damage. Now, of course, you do have Choice Belt to bump this up to 120, which is admittedly pretty decent. But even at that point, you're still 3-shotting Pokemon VSTAR. But I guess in theory, you could make the argument that yes, you aren't taking these big one-shots, but you're trading that extra aggression for a very disruptive strategy. So who knows, maybe I'm being a little bit harsh on this damage output. And the last issue that Vileplume is going to face, though I don't think it's probably its biggest hurdle, is going to be the energy cost for a grass and 2 colors. 3 to do 90 is not that great. Now, luckily, this attack cost is a little flexible because of the color synergies. That means we can power Vileplume up with just twin energy and 1 more attachment. So at that point, you're only a twin energy plus a Raihan away from setting up a fresh Vileplume. Or maybe you could choose to play like a 1-1 or a 2-2 Chairman to be able to cheat that additional grass energy that you need every turn. But I just feel like a lot of decks have answers to this. Decks like Arceus VSTAR don't really need a lot after the second turn to deal with a deck like Vileplume, since they can just Trinity Nova every single turn of the game. Decks like Palkia VSTAR have cards like Radiant Greninja to be able to cycle through their deck even under some of these locking effects. And we still have other cards like Trekking Shoes and Pokestop and Barrel, all sorts of ways to get around these sort of locking effects. So despite Vileplume's very annoying and oppressive locking effects it's had throughout the Pokemon TCG, I don't think this one quite lives up to its predecessors. So we have 2 cards that we're going to discuss here. That is going to be Hisuian Electrode V, as well as a brand new Parasect. So different cards, but really the only use Parasect has is going to be with Electrode, so we'll just discuss them both here together. So the Hisuian Electrode V, let's take a look at this thing. It does have a second attack that can do 120, but honestly, we will probably never use this if we ever are building around this card. We're pretty much looking at this thing for its first attack for 0 energy, does 100 for each special condition on this Pokemon. Now, normally this would be a really horrendous effect for an attack, but luckily the new Parasect is going to fix that for Electrode. It has an ability that says when you play this card from hand to evolve one of your Pokemon, you may use this ability and both active Pokemon are now asleep and poisoned. Okay, so now we're starting to make something happen here. 2 special conditions means Electrode can attack for 200 plus the 10 damage from poison for 0 energy, which isn't that bad. That can deal with a lot of unevolved Pokemon V, but we're still kind of shy at knocking out those Pokemon V-Star and V-Max out there. But guys, we have to remember we actually got an item card not too long ago called Spicy Seasoned Curry that can inflict burn on your Electrode. And now once you factor that in, we're hitting for 310 for 0 energy. Guys, that's going to one-shot any Pokemon V-Star running around, and even some of the weaker Pokemon V-Max like Mew or Jolteon. But if we do want to get over that 310 hump, we're also getting Radiant Hisuian Sneasel, which will be discussed later in this set review, that will increase your poison damage a little bit more as well. Now, of course, the last issue that you guys probably have been thinking in your mind here as well, we can't attack if we're asleep, but luckily we are getting a new Pokemon tool in this set as well that will allow Electrode to attack even while it's asleep. And at that point, guys, we're one-shotting any Pokemon in the format for 0 energy. Now, of course, this whole strategy is pretty combo reliant, as you can tell, but not needing energy means that we have a little bit more extra deck space than most decks out there. Now, what winds up being the best engine for Electrode, I think is still up in the air. Could be Inteleon, could be Barrel. There's definitely some different ways you can go with this, but I gotta say, I kind of have a soft spot for this Hisuian Electrode deck idea. I think the thing sort of keeping my enthusiasm in check a little bit is, first of all, as I've sort of outlined, this is a pretty combo reliant deck. You need the Parasect every turn, you need the Electrode every turn, the Spicy Seasoned Curry, and the Pokemon Tool card. But on top of that too, Hisuian Electrode V is kind of like a glass cannon. It only has 210 HP, which means it's pretty much going to get knocked out by anything running around. And if you happen to be the player in your match that gets the first multi-prize Pokemon knocked out, I think it might be difficult for you to actually wind up winning, because most Pokemon V-Star and V-Max are going to much more easily be able to knock you out than you will be able to return KO them. So going second in particular definitely could be rough for this theoretical deck. But even still, maybe I'm just a sucker for these fun combo-oriented decks, but being able to do 300 plus damage for 0 energy is at least, I think, worth testing out. Next up, we have a new Beautifly. Beautifly is going to be, of course, a Stage 2 Pokemon, only clocking in at 130 HP, has a pretty bad attack for a Grass and Colorless that does 70 and heals 30, which is hilarious since everything is just going to knock this out anyways. But the ability, by far and away, the star of the show here, and actually is an amazing ability. It says once during your turn, you may draw cards from your deck until you have 6 cards in your hand. So yes, this is Crobat V's ability, but you can activate it every single turn, or you can think about it as a better version of the ability that we've seen on Barrel. So that means every deck is going to cut Barrel out of their deck and start putting in Beautiflies, right? Well, I probably wouldn't go that far. Like, yeah, the ability is good, but of course the big issue is this is going to be on a Stage 2 Pokemon, which means Beautifly is not nearly as splashable in decks as Barrel is. We've seen decks sometimes play just a 1/1 Barrel because it only takes up 2 spots. It's easy to find when you need it. But Beautifly is going to require a much bigger commitment of deck space if you do want to include this thing. You're either going to have to play a 1/1/1 line and manually evolve through 3 turns to get this thing into play, assuming you don't discard any of these with researches along the way, or you're going to have to play Rare Candy. And if you're a deck that's not already playing Rare Candy, this feels just super clunky. Like, yeah, there are like weird situations where Beautifly might be kind of consistent. Like if you're a deck that plays Turffield and other grass Pokemon and Rare Candy already, like, yeah, maybe you can play a thin line of this, like maybe in some theoretical Rillaboom deck, or maybe if you're playing something like Hisuian Logant VSTAR, you can use your VSTAR power to search out your Beautifly pieces. But guys, I'm really grasping at straws here to come up with a situation where this card could be playable. It's a great ability. Like I said, in a vacuum, ignoring all other attributes of this card, it is fantastic. But of course, Barrel and Crobat V both exist. They are much easier to use. I don't think the 1 extra card that you get from this ability is worth all of the hoops that you're going to have to jump through being a Stage 2 Pokemon. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to pass on Beautifly. So up next, we finally have our first Lost Zone Pokemon. That's going to be Shiftry, another Stage 2 Grass Pokemon here. So Shiftry has 2 attacks. The first one for a single Grass energy does 50, and you may have your opponent switch their active with one of their benched Pokemon. Nothing too special, but the second attack, a little bit more interesting. For just a single Grass energy, you do 210 and put this Pokemon and all cards attached to it into the Lost Zone. So there is definitely a mix of good and bad, and as you can tell by my rating, I think a little bit more bad than good, but 210 for 1, pretty solid, I've got to say. However, the state of the game right now is very much so based around evolving Pokemon V, so 210 is effectively no different than doing 140 or 170, depending if you're going against, say, VSTAR or VMAX. And even with the Choice Belt, you're going to be a good bit of damage shy, even from knocking out a Pokemon VSTAR. So the damage, even though at a glance seems really cool, it's not actually as impactful as you would initially probably think here. And honestly, that's about where my enthusiasm for Shiftry ends. There's a lot of negative to this card, unfortunately. You know, having to put Shiftry in the Lost Zone is pretty bad, because even though this does kind of synergize with some of the other Lost Zone cards, there's much easier ways at getting cards in the Lost Zone than using this Stage 2 Shiftry. And if we're just kind of building around Shiftry, well, going into the Lost Zone is pretty bad because, first of all, we can't play cards like Ordinary Rod to recover Shiftry, but also we still have to promote a new Pokemon after we attack, which means you're going to get rid of your Shiftry and then also have to feed your opponent another Pokemon that they can potentially knock out. Now, of course, you can play things like Miltank if you do want some sort of wall to throw up after you attack. But guys, we're kind of asking for a lot at this point. I just don't see the incentive to play Shiftry over the other single prize or even some of the other Stage 2 attackers that we have in the format. You don't hit anything for weakness, it doesn't synergize with the other Shiftry we have in format, and is nowhere near the best way at helping out some of the other Lost Zone based cards we're getting in the set. So Shiftry, it's going to be a pretty big swing and a miss, I would say. So next up we have a Grass Trevenant here, Stage 1 Pokemon with a very cool ability. It says if this Pokemon is knocked out by damage from your opponent's Pokemon V's attack, your opponent does not take a prize card. It then just has 1 attack of its own for 2 grass and a colorist is 150, and this Pokemon can't attack during your next turn. So let's just get the elephant in the room out of the way with this thing. If you go against any sort of single prize deck with Trevenant, you're going to get pretty much annihilated, more than likely at least. But if you are fortunate enough to go against these Pokemon VSTAR and VMAX based decks, I think Trevenant actually has a good bit going for it. In theory, at least, you can keep just promoting these Trevenants turn after turn and denying your opponent taking prize cards. Now, it's not completely bulletproof here because your opponent can still play things like Escape Rope, they can play Boss's Orders, there's other ways they can still get prize cards. But you've got to imagine there's probably going to be around 3 turns of the game where they're going to be forced to attack in Trevenant and not get anything as a result here. And the damage output on Trevenant, not bad at all either. 150 doesn't seem like a lot, but you're already 2-shotting Pokemon VSTAR, and with the Choice Belt, you're 2-shotting any Pokemon VMAX. I'm personally completely content trading 2 shots on 2 and 3 prize Pokemon where your opponent gets 0 prizes in exchange. Now, of course, needing 3 energy is going to be kind of the challenge with this card. So more than likely, you are going to be playing Cherrim to be able to accelerate your grass energy. But honestly, that's not that horrible because both of your core Pokemon of the deck are going to be grass evolutions that can be searched out with Turffield. And once you get in a groove with your deck, we have supporters like Clara that can get back an entire Trevenant line plus the energy you need to recharge onto your next one. However, even though a lot of the time you are going to be forcing your opponent into not taking any prizes, there is a world where they can still just run you out of resources. Because Trevenant is not the heaviest hitting Pokemon in the world, and if you just run out of attackers, that's the way your opponent can still get around this. So between just running out of resources and your opponent playing things like Boss's Orders, there is still a world where your opponent just kind of wins that way. So you can tell I have a little bit of reservation for Trevenant, but I think this is a really cool single prize Pokemon and probably one of my favorites if I'm being honest from this set. So absolutely it's going to be a card I'm going to test out, but I do have a few reservations, even though I am generally leaning a little bit more towards the positive side when it comes to this card. Next up, we have yet another Stage 2 Grass Pokemon. This is going to be Orbeetle, clocking in at a miserable 110 HP. But luckily, honestly, it doesn't matter too much. There's not much of a difference between like 110 and 160 these days anyways. But anyways, looking at the ability, definitely I think one of the most interesting parts about this card, it says once during your turn, whenever you play this card from your hand to evolve a Pokemon, you may attach up to 3 energy cards from your opponent's discard pile to their Pokemon in any way that you like. And then its only attack here for 2 colorless energy does 30 plus 50 more for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. So you guys can sort of instantly see the synergy they are pushing here. Evolve an Orbeetle, take a bunch of energy from your opponent's discard, put it on their active, swing on them for a lot of damage. And honestly guys, I don't exactly hate this attack. I know this ability is kind of the thing that's been giving this card the most attention, but I think you have kind of a decent two-shotting attack that can sometimes cheese you a big one-hit knockout as well. Because most decks right now running around are attacking for around 2 to 3 energy, so let's be a little bit conservative and say they only need 2 energy to attack into. Well, guess what? That's still 130 damage executing Choice Belt, and that's not even factoring the additional energy that you might be accelerating to their Pokemon whenever you evolve into your Orbeetle. So if they have 3 more energy sitting in their discard, well, guess what? That is going to allow you to one-shot those Pokemon V-Star and V-Max running around. But let's get back to this ability for a second, because there's some pretty cool things I think you can do with this. So of course, not only can you use this to, fuel your own attack on Orbeetle, but you can even use this to make use of other Pokemon you could potentially play, with the most notable one probably being the Single Strike Beedrill, because Beedrill has that very powerful attack for a single grass energy that will allow you to just instant KO Pokemon with special energy. So if your opponent is playing around Beedrill, you can actually force them to have special energy, since this ability does not specify basic or specials. And there's quite a few decks with special energy still running around. Of course, we have Arceus VSTAR, we have Mew VMAX, we have the brand new Hisuian Zoroark VSTAR. So that's really where my head is at with this thing. But there are some other sort of fringe things you could do with this, like you can accelerate special energies to wall it to route on VMAX. You could accelerate any energies to do more damage with Starmie V, etc. But as you guys can tell, we're getting kind of into meme territory at this point. I like the Orbeetle. I think it's a fun card, but it is a stage 2, and the ability just kind of inherently is a little inconsistent since your opponent can play around it. So currently, I'm not expecting a whole lot from this card. Next up, we have a brand new Chandelure card. This is going to be another stage 2. We've looked at a good bit of stage 2s in the set review already, I just realized. But this one is going to be a fire Pokemon, 150 HP, has this ability, which is really the star of the show. The attack here is pretty much garbage. But the ability says, once during your turn, whenever you play this card from hand to evolve a Pokemon, you may discard the top 3 cards from your opponent's deck. So I will say, just right out the gate, there's actually a lot of cards that really do synergize well with Chandelure here. We do have to remember we have the top entry Lampet still in format, so that might make chaining these a little bit easier, since I do imagine you probably want to just keep swarming these abilities with Chandelure every turn potentially. We still have Scoop Up Net in the format to allow us to reuse this ability, and we still have a ton of other milling cards to sort of double down on this whole strategy, whether it's Curse Shovel, Carbominable V. There's a new supporter card in this set review that we'll get to that mills a couple of cards potentially as well. But guys, if you haven't been playing for a while, this is actually an ability we've seen over the years on a number of different Pokemon, and none of them have been particularly great. The last one that saw any play to my recollection was the Aggron back from Dragons Exalted. This was all the way back in 2012. It was kind of a meme deck that people brought out to smaller events, but was definitely never sort of a serious top tier deck. And unfortunately, I do kind of expect the same to be the case for Chandelure here, especially if we compare this to something like Durant, which I think is going to be generally a lot easier to get up and running. That's a deck that, again, despite being kind of a fun meme that can admittedly win you games from time to time, is not much of a contender. And like I said, that is a more consistent version of what Chandelure wants to do. So even though I personally love Chandelure as a Pokemon, yes, I know I'm like the only one out there, I feel like, I do have to pass on this guy, unfortunately. And next up, we have another one of these Lost Zone Pokemon. This is going to be Delphox V, but it has 2 attacks here. For 1 fire, it makes your opponent's active burned and confused. So just kind of a mediocre defensive attack in the early game. But the second attack, definitely a lot better here for 2 fire, and a colorist is 120. And you put 2 energy cards, attach this Pokemon into the Lost Zone, and the attack does 120 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So 120 for 3, definitely not the best, but 120 to 2 Pokemon for 3, suddenly you have my attention a little bit more here. In theory, at least, if you use these attacks back to back, you can actually take 4 prizes over the course of 2 turns if you're attacking into basic Pokemon V. If your opponent does start to evolve, that's where things get a little bit tricky, unfortunately, because even with a Choice Belt, you're still only going to climb up to effectively 270 total amount of damage that you're doing between 2 turns, which unfortunately means you would need a 3rd attack to knock out all of the popular Pokemon V-Star running around, with maybe the exception being the brand new Zoroark V-Star. So honestly, I don't really see us playing like a designated Delphox deck, especially since there's nothing super relevant that's weak to fire right now. But certainly there's a few ideas that I'll at least throw out there for this card. Of course, even though this is going to be a clunky attack cost, you do have to remember we have the new Mirage Gate item card coming out that is going to allow us to power up Pokemon once we have a certain number of cards in the Lost Zone. So that can help deal with this tricky 3 energy attack cost. Or we can just play good old fashioned tried and true Arceus VSTAR. Honestly, in that situation, I don't really hate Delphox because if we're attacking with Arceus and we're doing 180, let's say, assuming we don't have a choice belt and we do have at least a double turbo energy attached, well, you know what? Even though we're not one-shotting anything with that, if our opponent does retreat on the next turn, we can actually attack into a fresh active with Delphox for 120 and then potentially finish off whatever was attacked that moved to the bench. So who knows, maybe Delphox V can be a decent cleanup attacker for Arceus decks out there. But of course, Arceus has a ton of great partners already, so needing to play Delphox is kind of a big ask. And we do still have that pesky downside of needing 2 energy cards into the Lost Zone if we ever do want to use this attack. Now, luckily, most of the time that's not going to matter too much since Delphox more than likely just going to be return KO'd on the following turn. But nevertheless, it is a downside to the card. And at that point, I almost rather just play Amazing Rare Raikou because it also can make use of the new Mirage Gate item card. Even though it also gets one-shot by pretty much anything, it only gives up a single prize. It doesn't have this same downside to its attack and hits for a better weakness on things like Palkia VSTAR. So Delphox, it has a couple of cool attributes, but I think overall there's probably just too many things going against this card. Next up, we're taking a look at Dewgong and Finneon. I think 2 of the main cards that really make up this new sort of swim freely archetype. And Finneon here is probably the glue that holds this archetype together with that ability that says, as often as you like during your turn, you may attach a water energy card from your hand to one of your Pokemon that has the swim freely attack. So if we think about it this way, as long as our Pokemon does have that swim freely attack, this is basically an upgraded version of what we currently have on Frostmoth. Finneon's only a basic Pokemon, and we can attach the water energy to any Pokemon, even Pokemon in the active spot, which is one of the big downsides that Frostmoth previously had to it. And there are a few Pokemon that we're getting in the set that have the swim freely attack, but by far and away, Dewgong is going to be the best one that we're getting here. The actual swim freely attack itself isn't that great. For a water energy, it does 10 damage, and if you flip a coin and get heads, you prevent all effects of attacks done to this Pokemon during your opponent's next turn. But I think the second attack here is really what makes this archetype kind of attractive. For 2 colorless energy, you shuffle any number of water energy from your Pokemon into your deck, and the attack does 40 damage for each energy shuffled in this way. So you guys can see the idea here. Every turn we want to dump a ton of energy into play thanks to Finneon, shuffle it back in, then next turn power through our deck again, and reattach all of that energy. And specifically, the last part there is kind of what gives me a little bit of pause about this potential archetype, because again, you have to refine your energy every time you want to attack with Dewgong here. Now, luckily, we definitely have some ways to kind of help out with that a little bit. Of course, Capacious Bucket is still lingering in the format that can easily search out 2 water energies at a time. And in terms of just digging through our deck every turn, of course, Cynthia's Ambition is going to be perfect for a deck like this to refill your hand up to 8 whenever something gets knocked out. And then you can still choose to play something like a Barrel on top of all this, just to give your deck a little bit more reach for those big one-hit KOs. And you probably are going to have to dig a little bit with this deck, because if you want to be able to one-shot some of the popular V-Stars, you're going to have to shuffle 7 energy back into your deck every single time. So every turn you're going to need bare minimum 7 energy and another Seal and Dewgong to replace your last one. So that is a lot to ask for, but if the Rapid Strike Malamar deck is any indication, these sort of strategies can be successful from time to time. You know, I was very harsh on that Malamar when it first came out. I thought it was going to do absolutely nothing. And as you guys probably know at this point, I was proven wrong about that. And so Dewgong, I'm kind of hoping it proves me wrong a little bit here. As you can see, I have not chosen to strictly downvote this pair of cards because, again, this is a pretty easy combo to get up and running. Finneon's a basic, Dewgong's only a stage 1. That's really not too hard to get set up. And with the format trending more and more towards Pokemon V-Star over Pokemon V-Max, that's naturally going to lower the damage cap that we need to hit for these one-hit KOs with our Dewgong. Single prize decks have not been doing that great lately, but I think Dewgong has enough going for it here to where this is probably one of the few single prize archetypes in the set that I think players should really take seriously. Next up, we have a brand new Hisuian Bascu Legion coming out. It has 2 attacks here. The second one for a water does 70, and you discard an energy from this Pokemon. But the first attack is definitely, I think, the more interesting of the 2. For 0 energy, this attack does 20 damage for each basic energy in your discard pile. Then shuffle those cards back into your deck. So even though this is a new card, this is not really a new effect in the format. We actually have a card right now that does something very similar. We have Volcarona V. Now, Volcarona does require energy to use its attack, and it is a multi-prizer, but it is a basic still, and it attacks for 1 energy. So it's in the same ballpark of playability, on paper at least. and that has seen virtually no play up until this point, partially just because there's not a whole lot of decks out there that really going to play an insane amount of energy to in turn be able to do lots of damage with this attack. Now, Basculegion does attack for 0 energy, whereas Volcarona attacks for fire energy. So Basculegion is naturally a little bit more splashable, and there actually is a pretty solid Basculin in the format too, that for 0 energy allows you to search for basic Pokemon. So the fact that Basculegion exists, I think might even make a case to be made for some decks out there to maybe try to play Basculin in their list, knowing that they can evolve into this thing for a big late game attack at some point. There's not too many decks I think really fall into this camp, but there are a few sort of rogue ideas I will throw out there for you guys. You do have to remember we still have Flareon VMAX in the format, as well as the Sandaconda back from Battle Styles. Both these attackers very aggressively mill your own deck to do more damage for each energy you're discarding, and Basculegion here might just offer those decks a strong late game hitter and a pretty good form of energy recovery as well. But as you can tell, we're talking about Sandaconda and Flareon VMAX. These cards aren't the most competitive, and I'm not sure how much Basculegion's really going to change that. But it is worth noting there is another new card we are getting in Lost Origin. That's going to be Radiant Steelix, which again is another one of these cards that extremely aggressively discards cards from your deck to do more damage for each energy that you discard. But out of all the Radiant Pokemon we're getting in this set, Steelix is not among one of the best ones in my opinion. And as a result, one of the best partners for Hisuian Basculegion are cards that see virtually no play, it definitely does make a difficult case to be made for this guy. Next up, we have our only Pokemon VMAX of the entire set. That is going to be Kyurem VMAX. So a lot of pressure on this guy to carry that VMAX flag for Lost Origin here. Now, Kyurem V is not particularly amazing, but the first attack is okay. For a water energy, you attach any number of water energy from your hand to your Pokemon. And as you'll see once we get to the VMAX here, you do want to play a good bit of energy with your Kyurems. So this could be a half decent attack to lead the game with to get set up a little bit better. But of course, taking a look at the VMAX, it's going to evolve and go all the way up to 330 HP. Metal Weakness, which has been somewhat irrelevant as of lately, and a 3 retreat cost. And it has this ability that says once during your turn, you may discard the top card of your deck. If it's a water energy, attach it to one of your Pokemon. And its only attack for 3 water energy does 120, and you discard any number of water energy from this Pokemon, and this attack does 50 more damage for each card discarded in this way. And there certainly are a number of ways we can power up our water Pokemon right now. Origin Palkia VSTAR has to be mentioned since that has been one of the most dominant cards in the format as of lately, and has a great VSTAR power that can power up a Kyurem kind of out of nowhere. And we still have Melanie in the format as well, which pairs pretty much perfectly with Kyurem since we're discarding energy every time we attack. Or we can just kind of go all in with Kyurem and get a bunch of these into play and try to chain these abilities every single turn. Now, even though this ability does stack and you can attach the energy to any Pokemon, the big issue, of course, is that the top card of your deck has to be water energy. So this is kind of annoying, but it's not an impossible challenge to overcome. Of course, we still have the Primate Wisdom Rancor in the format that will allow us to switch card in hand with the top card of our deck. Or we also have cards like Switching Cups that allow us to do the same thing, but as an item card. But my big issue with Kyurem VMAX just comes down to the damage output that we have here. Most of the popular attackers are going to have around 280 HP, and even though Kyurem VMAX here can hit those numbers by either discarding 3 energy or discarding 2 energy plus a choice belt, I've got to say, I think Ice Rider Calyrex kind of just does the same thing, but better. Kyurem forces you to have an extra energy just to get off its attack to begin with. So if you're trying to set up a fresh Kyurem, a Melanie plus a manual attachment is actually not even going to get you set up. Now, where Kyurem does start to shine a little bit is against Pokemon VMAX, because you can discard that extra water energy to take a one-shot on things like Mew, Duraludon, etc. Now, throughout the Lost Origin format, if we do start trending back towards a more VMAX-heavy metagame, Kyurem's not that bad. I gotta say, this is not an awful VMAX by any standard. But as long as the most popular Pokemon are cards like Arceus, Origin Palkia, Giratina, etc., I think Ice Rider is just going to be a more efficient way at accomplishing the same thing. Next up, we have another one of these Lost Zone cards, and that's going to be Cramorant. Cramorant's just a basic Pokemon with 110 HP, and it has this ability: if you have 4 cards or more in your Lost Zone, ignore all energy in this Pokemon's attack costs. And it's only attack for 2 water and a colorless, or hopefully 0 energy if we're playing Cramorant, does 110, and it's not affected by weakness. So initially, I didn't think a whole lot about this card. It seemed pretty low impact at first glance, but the longer this card has sort of marinated in my mind, the more I've come around to actually liking it a good bit here. So right out the gate, this does give us another answer to cards like Miltank. It only gives up 1 prize, so if our opponent does have something like a Sobble or a Comfey in the active spot, we would much rather attack with something like Cramorant as opposed to our big hulking Pokemon VSTAR. And only needing 4 cards in your Lost Zone as opposed to the 7 that the new Mirage Gate item card requires means that you can get Cramorant ready to go and start attacking a lot quicker than your Pokemon that you are waiting to accelerate energy to with that new Mirage Gate item that we're going to talk about later in this set review. And for my players who have been around for a few formats now, I could actually even see a world where you make a Cramorant deck that's kind of like the old baby Buzzwole decks back during the Sun and Moon era when we had Beast Ring and Ultra Beasts, where you just kind of lead the game with these easy Pokemon to get set up like Cramorant or the old baby Buzzwole, and then you just kind of lead with them for several turns until your Beast Rings, or of course now the new Mirage Gate, is ready to activate, and then maybe you close out the game with your big V-Stars, but lean heavily on maybe even 2, 3, or 4 of these Cramorants in the early game. Since it can knock out low HP Pokemon and with the Choice Belt can 2-shot Pokemon V-Star, but I think at the very least I'm playing at least one of these just as a one prize option. So what looks like a pretty mediocre card at a glance, I think actually is a pretty solid inclusion for your different Lost Zone based decks out there. Going on to our next Pokemon V-Star, we have Magnezone. 270 HP, fighting weakness, and a 2 retreat cost. And its first attack for lightning and 2 colorless is 180, and you search your deck for up to 2 item cards, reveal them and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. And its V-Star power for 2 lightning energy, it does 90 to 2 of your opponent's bench Pokemon. The double 90 snipe after this set in particular is pretty good because right now I definitely am expecting the whole Lost engine to catch on, with a lot of decks playing these puny 70 HP comfies on their bench. Being able to get an easy 2 prizes that way is great, and we still have plenty of decks running around too that are playing the Inteleon engine, so being able to get easy prizes on things like Comfey or Sobbles or Drizzles is definitely a pretty good attribute to have for this card. And also 90 is a pretty solid number to set up math to knock out Pokemon V-Star with. Because if we get in some chip damage with this V-Star power and then follow up with its primary attack, we're only 10 damage away at that point from being able to one-shot some of these popular Pokemon V-Star like Arceus and the new Giratina. So we can easily fix that with things like Choice Belt, Galarian Zigzagoon, even Inteleon if you want to build the deck in that way. And then we still have the other, I think, pretty big selling point to Magnezone. That's going to be the effect this first attack has. Being able to search your deck for up to 2 item cards is huge. Now, yeah, this is a little bit more limiting than Togekiss VMAX, which gets you any cards, but I think the trade-off to do a much more sizable amount of damage here is kind of worth it a lot of the time. And luckily, most items can kind of get you into whatever you need. Like if you need a supporter card, you can get Pokegear. If you need a Pokemon, you can grab Ultra Ball. So I don't think this is that big of a downside compared to Togekiss. But the fact that we get 2 item cards is also great because that means we can grab these combo-oriented items like Cross Switcher, or maybe we can grab some of those one-of tech items like Tool Scrapper that are traditionally a little bit tough to find on the turns that you need them. Now, of course, we do have to watch out for cards like Marnie or Roxanne in the late game, but realistically, your opponent's not playing these supporters every single turn of the game. And if you are really dead set on protecting your hand, you can even play the Rapid Strike Milotic. But you can probably tell by my rating, I do have a little bit of pause when it comes to this Magnezone. The first thing is the attack cost that we have here with Magnezone. Like, yeah, we can use double turbo energy to help get this thing up and going. And speaking of double turbo energy, there is some sort of natural awkwardness built in here because you kind of want to lead the game with the V-Star power since it is a little bit of a lower attack cost. But the issue there is you need 2 actual lightning energies. And at that point, you still need another energy for your primary attack. And double turbo energy kind of becomes pointless. So as a result, it almost kind of forces you to save this V-Star power for the late game. Unless you're shying away from double turbo energy and leaning much more heavily on regular lightning energy, like maybe in some sort of Flaffy based deck. I'm also really not stoked that you have to have Choice Belt or Telescopic Sight if you want the math between the V-Star power and the main attack to work out, because this means you can't play Big Charm, which definitely could be an issue with some of these new one-hit KO-oriented Pokemon coming out, like the new Giratina and Hisuian Zoroark. And just in general, guys, I do kind of worry if Magnezone can go toe-to-toe with some of the other big decks that are going to be running around after the set drops. As I just mentioned, cards like Hisuian Zoroark VSTAR and Giratina VSTAR can make quick work of Magnezone. Mew Max, I don't think it's going to struggle that much. Ice Rider can easily one-shot you. I'm just a little bit worried about how Magnezone slots into this new format that we're about to enter into. Like, yeah, having a good matchup against things like Flying Pikachu and Origin Palkia is great and all, but is there a great reason to play this when a lot of decks running around can one-shot you and some of the other 2-hit KO-oriented decks might just be a little bit better? These are the sorts of challenges that it's going to have to overcome if it does want to see play. Next up, we have another sort of pair of Pokemon we kind of have to talk about together. That's going to be Rotom V and Porygon 2. Rotom V is going to be a Fighting Weak 190 HP basic Pokemon V, and it has this ability: once during your turn, you may draw 3 cards, and if you do, your turn ends. And its only attack here for 2 lightning energy, it does 40, and you may put any number of Pokemon tools from your discard pile into the Lost Zone, and this attack does 40 more damage for each card put into the Lost Zone in this way. And as you guys can see, we also have a Porygon 2 coming out that also kind of pairs nicely with this Rotom V. It just has a single attack for a colorless energy. It does 20 for each Pokemon tool card in both players' Lost Zones. So this deck idea, I think, kind of builds itself. You want to lead the game with Rotom V, and then towards the end of the game, you come in with those Porygon 2s to take these big one-hit KOs. So I think this deck idea seems pretty fun. You know, this will definitely be one that I cover on the channel at some point, but you know, I gotta say, this doesn't exactly strike me as the most competitive deck. This definitely seems very clunky to actually get up and going, because realistically, if you want to take these big one-shots with your Rotom Vs and your Porygons, you're gonna need to play at least like 20 Pokemon tools in your deck. And if you're doing that, your consistency is taking a big hit, because those 20 plus spots are spots in your deck that would normally be taken up by other, usually better cards. Now, of course, there are some ways at getting around this. At the very least, we have Lucky Egg still in the format, so that is a Pokemon tool you can play if you want that will at least allow you to refill your hand from time to time. But I definitely worry about consistency issues with this deck here. And I think the other issue I have, specifically in the case of Rotom V here, is going to be that 2 energy attack cost. It doesn't seem like a lot, but that does mean you have to run some way at cheating energies into play. So whether that has to be with something like a Flaffy, or if you want to make use of EXP share, you are going to need something to be able to keep streaming these Rotom Vs until you're ready to pivot into your Porygon 2. And I think that's kind of the issue. You want Lucky Egg on Rotoms, you want EXP shares on Rotoms, you want Choice Belt to hit for better numbers. And while, yeah, you can play Shopping Center as your stadium of choice if you do want to be able to rearrange your Pokemon tools, guys, we're just jumping through a lot of hoops here to get this Rotom to work right. I think if there's any saving graces for this particular archetype is that, you know, Rotom, it hits for a great weakness. You're going to be able to one-shot things like Palkia VSTAR and Flying Pikachu VMAX pretty easily with this thing. And then also the Porygon 2 is really easy to get set up. It just requires a single energy. And I think there actually might even be a world where maybe you just build around Porygon 2. Like maybe you just play like a ton of Comfies, Colress, etc. and just try to manually get Pokemon tools into the Lost Zone that way. But yeah, guys, despite having kind of a pseudo Intrepid Sword ability, despite hitting for a pretty good weakness, and despite actually having a lot of cards that synergize with this strategy, whether it's the shopping mall I already pointed out, cards like Mew and Oranguru V to make finding your tools a little bit easier, cards like Speed Lightning Energy to speed up your deck, I just think at the end of the day, this is going to be too clunky of a strategy to actually be successful. Next up, guys, we have a brand new Clefairy. Yes, that's correct. We're not looking at Clefable. Clefable's straight trash compared to this card. Clefairy has a surprising amount of potential here. It has this ability: once during your turn, if this Pokemon is in the active spot, you may search your deck for a Psychic Energy and attach it to each of your bench Clefairy, then shuffle your deck. And its attack for 3 colorless energy does 20 for each Psychic Energy attached to all of your Pokemon. This form of energy acceleration Clefairy has actually snowballs really quickly once you get all these Clefairies into play. Because guys, if you have all 4 Clefairy in play, and if you can find a switching card to be able to use each one, you can actually accelerate up to 12 energy in a single turn. That is insane. And there's a ton of switching cards in the format to make this happen. Obviously, there's good old-fashioned Switch, but we also have Escape Rope, we have Switch Card, we even have Bird Keeper as your supportive return if you want. Maybe throw in a Galarian Articuno and a couple of EXP shares. You can actually keep a scary amount of energy into play with this Clefairy. I think people might initially look at Clefairy and think, maybe we can play this with something like Shadow Rider. But honestly, I think Clefairy, even on its own, being a puny 60 HP Pokemon, might even be the best attacker for this whole engine that we have here. But I understand 60 HP, you're not tanking any hits with this thing. You don't want to lose your energy accelerators. So maybe there's even a world where Mewtwo VSTAR could have just found its best partner here. Mewtwo, I think, on paper, looks like a pretty strong card, but at the time of recording, it has kind of struggled to catch on a bit. But thanks to these Clefairies, you always have a plethora of energy in play to be able to discard with your Mewtwo's attacks. And all you need is a few copies of Energy Switch in the deck as well, and now you can be able to power up your Mewtwo's in a single turn too. So you guys can probably tell I'm actually kind of excited for this new Clefairy. If I did have any pause about this card, it would definitely be how this slots into the format with the new Lost Zone cards coming out in the same set. Cards like Cramorant and especially the new Sableye in the late game can make quick work of cards like this, and 60 HP also is within that sniping range of the quick shooting Inteleon to be able to cheat some extra prizes that way as well. And even in terms of multi-prize attackers, Flying Pikachu VMAX is still a card that has been seeing play, and unless you do decide to play something like Mewtwo VSTAR with your Clefairies, this hypothetical Clefairy Swarm deck isn't really going to have a good out against that sort of attacker. So like with a lot of these one prizers we've been talking about throughout the set review, I do think Clefairy has some challenges to overcome, but it's definitely a very promising card, and I think one at the least to keep an eye on. Next up, we have Gengar, one of the premier sort of single prize Pokemon we're getting in this set. Most notably, due to this ability, it says once during your turn, you may put this card from your discard pile onto your bench. If you do, put 3 damage counters on this Pokemon. And then it does have an attack for Psychic Energy. It says put 2 damage counters on your opponent's active for each of their benched Pokemon. So the attack, not too shabby. If your opponent does have a full bench, you can put 10 damage counters on them for a single Psychic Energy. It's okay, it's fine. The ability is by far and away the reason you would ever want to consider playing Gengar, and most notably to be paired with the brand new Hisuian Zoroark VSTAR. Absolutely one of the best new attackers that we're going to be getting in this set. Zoroark is so anticipated due to that attack that it has that requires each of your Pokemon to have damage counters on them. And Gengar is going to be an easy way at fulfilling that attack. You can just Ultra Ball, Professors of Research, Quick Ball away these Gengars throughout the course of a game. And as you need them, you can pull them out of your discard pile and get some damage counters on them in the process. And even use cards like the new Damage Pump item we'll talk about later to maybe even move some of that damage around too. I definitely think that's sort of like the obvious combo everyone's going to be looking at when the set drops, but there's still some other Pokemon I do want to give a shout out to that Gengar does look to buff a little bit. Keeping that same sort of theme that Zoroark has, we actually have a single strike Primeape that's still in the format that does something very similar, but it's only a single prize Pokemon, hits for an amazing weakness, and has access to all of the different single strike cards like Single Strike Energy, Houndoom, etc. So between Houndooms and now with this Gengar, it's easy to sort of fulfill that attack that, again, is so similar to Zoroark's to hit for these giant knockouts. But beyond these sorts of deck ideas, there's a couple grass Pokemon I also will briefly mention. Of course, we have that Stage 2 Torterra that does more damage for every evolution you have in play. Up until now, people have tried things like Beedrill or Empoleon, but both of those cards are sometimes awkward to make use of, and I think Gengar is going to be a much easier way at cheating some of those evolutions in play. And a card that I've always had a soft spot for that's kind of just been waiting for the right time to shine might be Serena V. This is definitely going to be a rogue that I plan on messing with at some point, but this might even be kind of the spiritual successor to the old Mega Gardevoir EX deck. The big issue Serena has kind of faced this whole time, though, is that it's had nowhere near the support of the old Mega Gardevoir deck, but thanks to some energy acceleration we've had over the past couple sets, and now this Gengar to be able to keep refilling your field after you discard your bench, might finally make Serena worth exploring a little bit. But guys, don't get confused. I think Hisuian Zoroark VSTAR is definitely going to be the main Pokemon we should be thinking about when it comes to this Gengar. It has at least one great partner, so as a result, it's definitely going to see play. So up next, we have our very first Radiant Pokemon that we're going to talk about today. That is going to be Radiant Gardevoir, which actually might even be the best of all the ones that we're going to look at today. But Radiant Gardevoir, mainly seeing some hype for this ability. It says your Pokemon take 20 less damage from your opponent's Pokemon V's attacks. And then it does have an attack of its own for a Psychic into Colorless is 70, plus 20 more for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. So let's get this out of the way. It's a very difficult ask to tell a deck that they shouldn't play Radiant Greninja. And maybe depending on the deck, Radiant Charizard. Radiant Greninja in particular has kind of cemented itself as a crucial part of a lot of draw engines, and I think that's only going to continue after Lost Origin as well. But I think Radiant Gardevoir is one of the few cards that does sort of make a good case for itself, because not only do we have a variety of tanking decks out there, but also this 20 reduction is particularly impactful for certain decks matchups too. I think some of the Dragon decks are some of the big ones that come to mind in terms of just trying to stay alive, tank a lot of damage, force your opponent into like 3-shotting you sometimes. I think that's most notably with cards like Duraludon VMAX or the brand new Hisuian Goodra VSTAR, since they can make use of cards like Crystal Cave, Big Charm, etc. And this sort of just allows those decks to double down on that strategy even further. But this can also be kind of an annoying math fixer for your opponent for certain matchups out there. I think a good example of this could be the new Giratina VSTAR. You're hitting for 280 damage, and in the mirror match, a card like Radiant Gardevoir actually can pretty significantly tip that prize exchange back in your favor if they're not playing something like Choice Belt, which is actually a possibility in that particular archetype. Or if you're one of the many 270 HP Pokemon, Radiant Gardevoir could narrowly put you out of range of a one-shot from cards like Mew Max or Origin Palkia VSTAR. So again, guys, this is going to be on a very case-by-case basis. Most decks that can use Radiant Greninja, I think, are, just because of the sheer consistency it brings to your deck, and in many cases, discarding the energy can also be a benefit to your deck's overall strategy. But that doesn't mean Radiant Gardevoir won't see play. If Radiant Greninja is going to be slotting into decks, let's say 60-70% of the time, Gardevoir here is going to be in that remaining pool of potentially viable Radiant Pokemon that will also be slotting into decks as well. Next up, guys, we have another card for some of these Lost Zone decks. That's going to be a brand new Sableye. Sableye is going to clock in at 80 HP, which is cool, does give it the benefit of being searched out with cards like Level Ball or Fog Crystal. And its first attack just does a measly 20 damage, but that's not the reason we're talking about this card. Definitely, it's going to be for this second attack for a Psychic Energy. You may use this attack, but only if you have 10 cards or more in the Lost Zone. And then you put 12 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon in any way that you like. So the 10 card ask in the Lost Zone does sound like quite a bit, guys. But honestly, after 2 to 3 turns, in my experience, it's not that hard to reach that 10 card amount. Because if you're using Comfy's ability at least twice per turn, plus the new Colress's Experiment, this is going to add up pretty quickly. And that's ignoring if you are playing any other cards like the new Lost City, Giratina V or VSTAR's attack, etc. But a 12 damage counter spread is pretty good. You know, just think if we're going against opposing Lost Zone based decks, let's just say Giratina VSTAR. A lot of times, if you are just down to a single prize in the late game, you can just slap down a Sableye. You don't even need boss's orders, attach a Psychic Energy, and pick off a remaining Comfy that they still have in play. So I could very easily see Sableye as just kind of like your late game finisher that just kind of steals an easy prize to seal the game against a lot of decks. But also, I will say there is a lot of support just kind of in general for these sorts of spreading archetypes. We still have the Horror Psychic Energy in the format and cards like Old Cemetery as well. So not only can you use Sableye as just some sort of late game finisher like I've outlined, but there is maybe a world where you lead the game with the Cramorant we looked at earlier, since it is going to get up and running a lot quicker. But then in the mid to late game, you pivot into your Sableyes and you just double down with all these other sort of spreading effects here to close out a game. But in terms of a rating for this card, I definitely did struggle a little bit here because I do like the card. Being able to have control over exactly where each damage counter goes is great. But 12 damage counters is kind of just narrowly out of range at knocking out some particular Pokemon, like some of the Radiant Pokemon, or being able to knock out maybe 2 Comfys at a time. And if we are playing some sort of Cramorant, Sableye, sort of Lost Zone deck like I outlined, I do worry the damage output is going to be a little on the low side overall, and having to wait to the mid game to even start using your Sableye is a little bit of a red flag. That being said, I'm definitely leaning much more close to saying I like this card overall. I still think this is definitely one of the single prize cards in the set you should be picking up and keeping an eye on. Continuing with our whole Lost Zone theme, we have the new Banette here. New Stage 1 Pokemon clocking in at 100 HP, which honestly does annoy me. I really wish this was 90 because that is the difference between being Level Ball searchable and having to use something like Ultra Ball or Evolution Incense. The main selling point to this card, though, is going to be this ability. It says, once during your turn, you may choose a supporter card from your discard pile, reveal it, and put it into your hand. If you do, put this Pokemon in the Lost Zone and discard all non-Pokemon cards attached to this Pokemon. And then, just to briefly mention, does technically have an attack, 2 Psychic Energy for 50, but more than likely you are never actually going to attack with Banette. But this ability on paper seems pretty cool. The big issue for some of these Lost Zone decks is that they really can't do a whole lot until they hit that magic 7 cards in the Lost Zone to be able to activate that Mirage Gate item card. And Banette is another option that we have here to maybe expedite that process a little bit. The entire ability just in general is a big consistency boost because not only can you grab maybe a draw supporter like the new Colress's Experiment, but also just by using this ability at all, you're also increasing the consistency of your other Lost Zone cards like the new Mirage Gate, like Giratina's VSTAR Power, etc. So on multiple different fronts, this card is a consistency booster, but as you guys can tell by my rating, I'm not totally sold on this card yet. We've seen a ton of these types of abilities over the years on a variety of Stage 1 Pokemon, like the Manectric back from Vivid Voltage, the Delcatty from Celestial Storm, the Crobat line from Battle Styles, etc. These cards almost always never see play. And that's because they're usually just outclassed by other cards. Having to play a Stage 1 takes up a lot of deck space. If we're playing realistically a 2-2 line, which I think would be the most common, well, I think we could honestly take those 4 deck spots and play other cards that also increase our consistency without having to play a Stage 1. I'd almost rather just use these spots for more switching cards, because that means we can just keep switching into Comfies over and over, which is already something we want to do, and by playing more outs to doing that, I think overall our deck is going to be more consistent. Or maybe some combination of switching cards and a tech card or two that we otherwise wouldn't have space for. I think its ability is good, but there's not many encouraging precedents set in the past of the game for a card like this to actually become a staple in these sorts of decks. As much as I don't want to, and I could see my opinion maybe shifting over time, I am for the moment going to commit to downvoting Banette. It's just one of these cards where it's not honestly bad at all. There's just other, debatably more efficient ways at accomplishing the same thing. Next up, guys, we have a brand new Hisuian Zoroark, and no, this is not the one I think people should be excited for. This is going to be a new single prize Zoroark, clocking in as a Stage 1 with 120 HP and 2 attacks here. The first one for 0 energy says, at the end of your opponent's next turn, the defending Pokemon is knocked out. And its other attack for 1 energy says, choose 1 card from your discard pile, reveal it, and put it into your hand. So it's kind of funny, while the other Zoroark is this super aggressive, heavy-hitting machine that can just blow through your opponent's deck, this is kind of the inverse. This Hisuian Zoroark definitely has more of a controlling vibe to it. Usually these sorts of attacks like Hex Ruin here don't wind up being very good. They're almost always pretty bad. But coupled with a controlling archetype, I actually can kind of imagine a world where you spend most of the game getting some sort of disruptive lock set up, and then you actually have a prize win condition at your disposal. Once you've sort of locked your opponent, run them out of resources, you can start knocking them out. And the best part about it is that they actually get knocked out at the end of your opponent's next turn, not during your turn. So what that means is you can still do all of your locking shenanigans, and then your opponent gets knocked out coming back into your turn to allow you to reset up your lock. But in terms of the whole sort of controlling aspect of the card, the second attack is really the one we want to look to. And this attack actually is a bit more flexible than some of the other similar attacks like this over the years. So one of the most notorious control cards that we've seen over the years has been the old Sableye from Dark Explorers with the Junk Hunt attack. This has been a very important control card. And Hisuian Zoroark in a way is a little bit better because you can get any cards, even special energies, stadiums, supporters. But of course, the big downside to this card is that you're only getting a single card at a time, and that's where my enthusiasm kind of wanes a bit. So even though we can get back these annoying cards like Galarmine, Yellhorn, Crushing Hammer, I think that's probably just too few resources to get back to be able to set up a really oppressive lock against your opponent. Zoroark is a Stage 1. It's not a basic like these older controlling cards like Sableye or the Oranguru more recently back from Ultra Prism, and it gets back fewer resources well compared to Sableye's 2 or Oranguru's 3. So I actually think on paper, this Hisuian Zoroark got kind of close to being an interesting control card, but this first attack is not good enough on its own to be built around, and the control card recovery aspect of this gets back too few resources to actually make it a viable control card. So as a result, I don't think this is going to be a very playable card. Next up, guys, we have Comfey, which is a card I've been referring to throughout this set review and probably will continue to do so as well. But it's going to be probably the backbone of this new Lost engine. And that's mainly due to this ability. It says once during your turn, if this Pokemon is in the active spot, you may look at the top 2 cards of your deck and put one of them into your hand and put the other card into the Lost Zone. So in a way, I could see how some people might look at this and think, well, this is just a worse version of the amazing rare Jirachi because we have to put cards into the Lost Zone. Jirachi, we don't have to. We can still use those cards later in the game. So why do people like this card? Like, I could see how someone would have that line of thought. But of course, what makes Comfey good is the fact that there are so many cards that reward you for having cards in the Lost Zone. As soon as you hit 4 cards, that means you can attack with Cramorant. As soon as you hit 7 cards, you can use Mirage Gate. And once you hit that 10 card number, there's things like the new Fantina supporter card, Giratina's VSTAR power, or even the new Sableye that we just talked about too. And since Comfey is just a basic Pokemon, we can actually spam this ability, I think, pretty consistently. We have cards like Air Balloon, Scoop Up Net, Switch, Escape Rope, even things like Switch Cart. And if you're kind of wondering how this card might play, I think a good comparison is that this is kind of like a Lost Zone version of the sort of Mew engine we've seen pop up in decks like Origin Dialga, and even like the Turbo Origin Palkia that saw play at some point, where you just keep picking up and reusing the Mew from Celebrations, or in this case, the new Comfey, to start just getting tons of cards into the Lost Zone ASAP. So I know Comfey, it's not the most intimidating Pokemon. It has a horrible attack. It's historically, I don't think actually had any really great cards, but that is definitely about to change. Comfey is by far and away, I think, one of the best cards we're getting in the set, and absolutely is going to see a ton of play in this whole new Lost Zone engine. Next up, we have Mimikyu. Mimikyu, of course, is a basic Pokemon here and has 2 attacks. The first one, not too impactful, just confusion for a Psychic Energy. But I definitely like this second attack a bit more for a Psychic and Colorless. Does 10 for each damage counter on all of your opponent's Pokemon. So Mimikyu is being pushed here to maybe be a sort of clean up finisher for certain decks out there, especially decks that aren't taking big one-hit KOs. And Psychic type definitely has no shortage of ways at spreading damage around the format. For example, we just took a look at the new Sableye a few cards ago, and I think on paper too, Mimikyu could make some sense there, because with Sableye already trying to get a ton of cards into the Lost Zone to be able to attack with it, you're naturally going to activate Mirage Gate, and as a result, you can get this attack powered up in a single turn, which I think overall is kind of the worst part about Mimikyu. And being able to circumvent that really honestly annoying second attachment with cards like Mirage Gate, or maybe Raihan if you want a more universal way at cheating energies into play, is, I think, a really attractive attribute in the specific case of this sort of Sableye or Lost Zone style deck. But I think we also have a couple of multi-prize Pokemon that are worth highlighting as well. Dragapult VMAX, it's been a card that has fallen from grace a bit. It was once one of the most dominant decks in the format, and now isn't really that relevant. And having a big sort of late game finisher in the form of something like Mimikyu could be a way for Dragapult decks to take a big one-hit KO, which is something that the deck has always kind of struggled with. And then a little bit more recently, we saw the introduction of Mewtwo VSTAR back in the Pokemon Go set. And Mewtwo definitely already has some one-shot potential with that Psy-Purge attack, but its VSTAR power might be a way we can set up some big KOs for Mimikyu here, because it's going to do 120 to each of your opponent's Pokemon V. And if they have even just 2 Pokemon V in play, this attack on Mimikyu is going to be hitting for 240, at least of course until you knock out those previously damaged Pokemon. And though this doesn't factor into my rating really today, I will also throw out there are some cards in Expanded that might want to make use of Mimikyu at some point, mainly because we have Dimension Valley to be able to use this attack for a single energy, but there are some good spreading attackers in Expanded like Trevenant Break, Weezing, etc. So if this does flop in Standard, it might have a home in that format. But getting back to Standard, I can't say I'm super enthusiastic about any of these options I laid out for you guys today. If we are playing some sort of Cramorant Sableye deck, I think one of the attractive parts about it compared to a deck like Giratina is that you don't really need to play cards like Mirage Gate to be able to get your main strategy set up. But in the case of Mimikyu, you would need something like Mirage Gate. And then looking at the multi-prizers you can play Mimikyu with, one is a card that has seen no serious play in like a year, and the other is a card that hasn't really seen play at all, and I don't think what Mimikyu is offering really radically changes that landscape for either of those decks. So all of this combined with the fact that you have to play cards like Mirage Gate or Raihan or Shadow Rider or some weird way at cheating additional energy on Mimikyu means that it's going to be, I think at least, too difficult to make use of this as a sort of closer Pokemon in decks. Next up, we have a new Stage 2 Dragapult coming out in the set. Dragapult here has that Dragon Launcher attack for a Psychic Energy. You may discard any number of your bench Dreepy up to the number of your opponent's Pokemon in play. For each Dreepy discarded in this way, choose one of your opponent's Pokemon, and this attack does 100 to each Pokemon chosen in this way. Don't apply weakness and resistance. I just think this attack is so cool. You're like literally using your Dreepies as ammo in the same way that Dragapult the Pokemon actually does that. I just think this attack is so cool. So in theory, you can be dishing out in total 400 damage every single turn of the game. And that's not factoring in things like Choice Belt or Telescopic Sight either. So if your opponent has 2 multi-prize Pokemon in play throughout these turns, you could actually technically win the entire game with just 3 attacks. And along the way, you can also probably get several prizes on the various single prize support Pokemon in the format, like Sobble and Drizzile, or even looking at the new Lost Zone engines, we can take easy prizes on Comfey along the way So at a glance, that seems pretty cool, but the first issue is you have to make sure you don't prize any, but of course you do have Hisuian Heavy Ball, so that'll fix that problem pretty easily. But beyond that, not only do we need to set up a new Dragapult every turn, but we also need to get 4 Dreepies onto the bench along with it. So we're going to need to play a ton of Pokemon Recovery. So probably some combination of Rescue Carrier, Ordinary Rod, and Clara to be able to keep chaining these Dragapult pieces every turn. But also, if we want to keep our damage at maximum capacity, you technically need a Dragapult in the active and 4 Dreepies on the bench, which seems impossible, but luckily we do have Zoroark to help out with that a little bit. So in theory, we can use Zoroark to transform into a Dracloak and then into a Dragapult on future turns. So you actually technically can get around having to use your Dreepies to evolve and instead just using them as ammo for your attacks. But guys, this is some serious clunk we're talking about here. And if we're using Zoroark to evolve into our Dracloak and we need 3 to 4 bench spaces for Dreepy every turn, where are our bench spaces for our support Pokemon? Whether it's Inteleon or Barrel, it seems like bench space is going to be a severe issue for this deck. Because more than likely, you're going to be attacking with a Dragapult in the active, you're going to have a Zoroark / Dracloak on the bench, and then you're going to have 4 Dreepies. And there goes all of your bench space. So unless we're playing like a heavy lucky egg count in this deck, it almost seems impossible to chain all of these combo pieces that we need every single turn of the game. And as a result, also, good luck finding a turn where you can take a turn off from playing a draw or recovery supporter and instead play boss to pick off a Manaphy at some point. And really any deck that's playing Manaphy is going to just wreck this Dragapult deck, especially if they play any Pokemon recovery at all. Because once Manaphy does become a factor, you're only hitting at max 100 damage or 130 with a choice belt to your opponent's active, and that's definitely nowhere near good enough being a stage 2. So Dragapult, this one breaks my heart a little because I love this card design, guys. I really want to see more creative cards designed in this manner, but unfortunately this particular one just happens to require, I think, a little too much to actually see competitive play. Next up, we have the very first Enamorous card for the Pokemon TCG. That is going to be Enamorous V. Its ability says, as long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, prevent all effects of your opponent's Pokemon's abilities done to your Pokemon with any psychic energy attached, except any Enamorous V. And its only attack for a Psychic into Colorless is 100, and you attach up to 2 basic energy cards from your discard pile to your Pokemon in any way that you like. I gotta say, this is a very mystifying card in terms of its card design philosophy. Like, this ability forces Enamorous to be in the active spot. Okay, so if we are in the active, we are more than likely attacking. But if we look at this attack, this is pretty weak overall, I've got to say. On paper, the attack has some redeeming qualities, like, okay, yeah, we're able to refresh maybe some energy in a play, maybe set up an attacker again that had to discard energy when they retreated. But instead of committing all of this energy to Enamorous V to do a absolutely pitiful 100 damage, or 80 if we're attacking with a double turbo, why not just sink the energy into the Pokemon that we wanted to power up in the first place? And also, is this ability even good enough to warrant jumping through the hoops and using this mediocre attack? Preventing effects of your opponent's abilities isn't bad. I mean, let's not get that misconstrued. We are going to prevent things like quick shooting on Inteleon. I don't think that's serious enough to where we want to build around attacking with this horrible card. I mean, I have no idea why this card didn't say as long as this Pokemon is in play, because you already have to have psychic energy attached to the Pokemon, which is already kind of a stipulation to make use of this ability. But requiring this card to be in the active spot is almost laughable given how weak this attack is. So Enamorous, this is a pretty bad card, and I'm really surprised this even released in Japan's main set. Like, this is the quality of card that we would see as like a Japanese promo or like in some starter deck over there. So yeah, this is a pretty bad card. I'm not expecting much at all from Enamorous V. Next up, we have Hisuian Arcanine, and after several sets of getting a few of these, I think we finally have one that might be worth playing here. Of course, Arcanine's going to be a Stage 1 Pokemon, and we're really just looking at it here for this first attack. For 0 energy, does 10 plus 150 more if you have no cards in your hand. I think players back from the Sun and Moon era specifically are really going to like this card, since it is kind of like the spiritual successor to the old Gramble deck that functioned very similar to this. But in a way, Arcanine's even better because it attacks for 0 energy and also does hit for a pretty good weakness right now, with cards like Arceus VSTAR and the new Hisuian Zoroark VSTAR running around. So 160 for 0 is definitely a really good damage to energy ratio. That's going to two-shot pretty much anything in the format, with the exceptions being some of those fighting weak Pokemon I already mentioned. But luckily for Arcanine, I think the format's actually in a good spot to where we have a lot of different tools that Arcanine can make use of. So I think some of the obvious examples here are going to be cards like Ultra Ball, Quick Ball, maybe even Peony. But being a fighting Pokemon also means that we can abuse Grant as a potential supporter, which I don't know how often makes a difference in terms of turning 2-hit knockouts into 1-hit knockouts, but Grant always being able to pitch away 2 cards at any given point is still, I think, a selling point for this deck. But the idea here is you don't want to leave yourself with a 0-card hand every turn, but you are going to have to rely on, I think, cards like Babarrel or even Radiant Venusaur finally could make its debut in this deck as well. So after you do play your hand down to 0 for this attack, next turn we can just refill it up with these different abilities that we have. And much like with the Hisuian Electrode V we looked at earlier in the set review, something I do like about Arcanine is that you naturally have a lot more deck space than most decks, since you don't really need much energy in your deck at all. I mean, technically you can play 0, but I still think you probably are going to wind up playing cards like Capture Energy, maybe even Twin Energy to have a retreating method. So I've got to say, guys, I am on board here for Hisuian Arcanine. It's not the heaviest hitting Pokemon in the world, and it does have kind of a convoluted attack requirement, but I think this could wind up being one of the more viable single prize decks we're getting out of this set. So I think I'm a fan of this one, guys. I'm looking forward to trying this one out. Next up, we have Machamp. This is going to be a new Stage 2 card, and it has this ability. It says if your opponent has 3 or fewer prize cards remaining, this Pokemon gets 150 HP. So we already have 150, so being able to climb all the way up to 300, definitely a pretty big selling point for the card. But then looking at its attack for 2 fighting energy does 100, and you can choose to do 100 more damage, but if you do, during your next turn, this Pokemon can't attack. So really quick, I don't think the whole not being able to attack thing is going to be that big of a deal. More than likely, you're going to be two-shotting a lot of Pokemon with this attack anyways. So I think the idea here is you just do a flat 100 for your first attack, and then next turn when it looks like your Machamp's going to go down, then you activate that plus 100 buff. And since you'll more than likely be knocked out in the following turn, it's not really a big deal. But obviously, guys, the ability is definitely what makes Machamp even kind of worth talking about today at all. Already being a single prize Pokemon is definitely good in a format where multi-prize Pokemon dominate the game. But creeping all the way up to 300 HP means that most decks are going to have to two-shot Machamp. And suddenly you're a single prize Pokemon that they have to two-shot. And guys, that is pretty big. You know, for decks like Mew V Max, things are going to be a little bit different. I don't see any way your Machamp deck is ever really going to beat Mew. But hey, you have to take a loss to something, right? But if you're still not even convinced the 300 HP is going to be enough, Machamp still has other tanking options that you can decide to play with it. So not only do we have cards in this set like Radiant Gardevoir and a new Stadium card that adds some extra tank ability to Machamp, but we still have some older cards lingering around in the format as well, like Stone Fighting Energy and Big Charm. I don't know if you really need more than 300 HP against non-psychic decks, but hey, the option is definitely there for you if nothing else. But I definitely have some reservations about this card, mainly when it comes to this attack. And of course, it also just being a stage 2 and being inherently a little bit difficult to get up and going. But a multi-energy attack cost on a stage 2 like this is definitely super sketchy for the first half of the game. Because a lot of the times, as soon as you get an energy on your Machop, your opponent's just going to boss it up or cross-switcher it up, and you're really not even going to get a chance to attack with your Machamp. So even though you are gaining this plus 150 buff, which is great, and I think will make your champ survive a lot of attacks, it just seems like for the first half of the game, you're just giving away 3 free prizes because of how just inherently difficult it is to set up this thing. Even though I really do like this ability on Machamp, I'm just worried between the innate inconsistency of being a stage 2 Pokemon, combined with that you have an attack that requires multiple manual attachments, and you don't really have the most amazing damage output, it's really difficult to get entirely behind this card. Next up, we have another fighting stage 2 Pokemon. This is going to be Rhyperior. Rhyperior is going to be a stage 2 with a whopping 190 HP. So a very tanky boy that we have here. Grass weakness for retreat and has 2 attacks, but I think the first one is the more interesting of the 2. For just 1 fighting energy does 50 and you discard the top card of your deck. If it's an energy, this attack does 100 more damage, then attach the discarded energy to this Pokemon. And this attack might actually sound a little bit familiar, and it should because this is almost the same attack that we have on Colossal VMAX. But that should be where red flags kind of start to go off a little bit. Because Colossal VMAX is a card that only kind of saw very limited play, and now we're trying to do the same thing but with a stage 2 instead. that's kind of a hard sell here. Of course, there are some popular fighting weak Pokemon we can hit for weakness, and we only give up a single prize compared to Colossal's 3. And even though we are a Stage 2 Pokemon with a fair bit amount of HP for a single prize Pokemon, I think a lot of decks are still just going to pretty easily one-shot us unless we really go all in on a ton of tanking options, which technically is possible to do. Of course, in this set, like I mentioned, we are getting the Radiant Gardevoir as well as a new Stadium card that will help our fighting Pokemon tank hits. So that's going to bump us up to effectively 230 HP. With Stone Fighting Energy, that's going to bump us up to 250. And if we play Big Charm, our opponent has to effectively do 280 damage or more if they want to knock us out. But there are a few decks that can still do that, I hate to say. Even if you do have to trade 2-hit KOs with opposing multi-prize Pokemon, more than likely their deck is going to set up more consistently than yours, and they might just be able to outpace you at that point. So yeah guys, we have a bunch of tanking options for Hyperior. We still have cards like Rotom Phone and Oranguru to be able to make this attack work pretty consistently, but I don't think the way to make Colossal VMAX's attack work is to print it on a Stage 2 Pokemon. Next up guys, we have another Lost Zone based Pokemon. This is going to be Aerodactyl VSTAR. So it's going to be a new VSTAR clocking in at 260 HP, so actually one of the weaker ones that we have running around, but this guy's going to be weak to grass with a 2 retreat, and its main attack here for a fighting in 2 colors is 240, and then you put the top 3 cards for your deck in the Lost Zone. And its VSTAR power for just a single colorless energy says, as long as this Pokemon is in play, it gains an ability with the effect your opponent's Pokemon V in play, excluding any Aerodactyl VSTAR, have no abilities. Okay, so have a lot of different thoughts in different directions on this card. Let's dive deeper here on this VSTAR power. I think it's actually a really cool ability that we have here, because of course this just shuts off some of the best abilities that we have in the game. Think of cards like Genesect V, Arceus VSTAR, Origin Palkia VSTAR. This takes some of the best effects in the game away from so many good decks. But my issue that I have here with Aerodactyl is that this is on a VSTAR. This is really the type of attack I think we would like to use on the first turn of the game, because really on turn 2, if we're not doing damage with Aerodactyl, we rather not have it in the active spot. Like, I guess if we go first, there is a world where maybe we want to use this on turn 2, but honestly, we would much rather have something else in the active, maybe a Cramorant to get in some chip damage, or just really anything to prevent our main attacker from going down here. And there are going to be times too where by the time you actually want to use this attack, your opponent might have already burned their VSTAR power. Or maybe if they're a Mew VMAX player, maybe they're already set up well enough to where they don't really care if their Genesects are going to go down. Or if they just return KO Aerodactyl, well, guess what? They have their abilities back at that point too. I think that really just leaves us with looking at this first attack. Doing 240 is a pretty respectable amount of damage. Of course, that's going to deal with basic unevolved Pokemon V, as well as some of the fighting weak Pokemon V-Stars, so that is all fine and dandy. But you are quite a bit of damage shy of taking a one-shot on most of the V-Stars running around. Now, you can get there with the help of a Choice Belt plus Galarian Zigzagoon that will allow you to hit that magic 280 number that a lot of these V-Stars have. But that's assuming you're powering up this attack without double turbo energy, because double turbo energy just kind of ruins your math for this attack. Not to mention putting 3 cards of your deck in the Lost Zone is pretty bad, and I don't even know if I like this in decks that are playing the whole Lost engine, just because, yeah, cards like Comfy or Colress's Experiment also put cards in the Lost Zone, but you have direct control over what those cards are. With Aerodactyl, you're kind of just going in blind unless you're playing cards like Oranguru or Rotom Phone. And if we are playing this whole Lost engine, why are we just not playing Giratina VSTAR? You have to jump through just as many hoops to get Aerodactyl up and running, but Giratina has no weakness, it has more HP, it one-shots anything that gets in its way for the same attack cost, basically. And if we're playing Aerodactyl in a deck that's not making use of the whole, Lost engine, this side effect of this attack is even worse in those instances. So yeah, I think Aerodactyl is a really big swing and a miss. Maybe control players out there might like this card for the V-Star power, but I don't really see a world where you're building around Aerodactyl as a main attacker, though. Hard pass. Up next, we have Gallade getting the Pokemon V treatment here. Basic Pokemon clocking in with 220 HP, of course, Psychic Weakness, then a 2 retreat cost, and it has 2 attacks. The second one, not too great, 2 fighting and a colorless for 130, goes through resistance. Nothing too special, but with a Choice Belt, I guess you can technically one-shot things like Arceus and Zoroark. But the first attack, I think, is the selling point of this card, really. For a fighting and colorless is 20, plus an additional 50 for each prize card you've already taken. So this is kind of like the inverse of cards like the Galarian Moltres that we've seen so many decks play over the past year. But in the case of Moltres, it was based on the prizes your opponent has taken. The big issue with Moltres, of course, course, is that you have to kind of wait around for your opponent, and your attacker only gets stronger the better your opponent's doing. But in the case of Gallade here, if you just had your thumb on your opponent the entire game and you're ready to just wrap things up, it's great to be able to just throw this down and sweep your opponent and not have to wait around for them to get back in the game to activate Moltres as your potential late game finisher. Now, where things get a little bit worse for Gallade is that it is going to be a multi-prize Pokemon. So starting with this thing is going to be a lot worse than had you started with Moltres. And also, Moltres powered itself up. Gallade, unfortunately, is going to need a little bit of help getting going. So if we are going to be playing Gallade, I think more than likely it's going to be in a similar context as Galarian Moltres, probably in some sort of Inteleon-based toolbox, where once you're ready to win the game, you slap this guy down, use Shady Dealings to find Raihan, and just mop over whatever your opponent still has in the active spot. We're never going to build around this card, but as a potential one-of closer in Inteleon decks, I can definitely see a world where this card could catch on, but I don't think it's set in stone. Like I said, I do think there are some pros to playing Galarian Moltres, and also we do technically have Galarian Zapdos V as another toolbox card that can one-shot fighting weak Pokemon pretty easily. So I'm not quite convinced of Gallade V, but I can still easily see how this card could pop up in certain decks. Up next, we have another Radiant Pokemon. This is going to be Radiant Hisuian Sneasler. This one has 130 HP, fighting weakness, in 1 retreat. Its ability here says put 2 more damage counters on your opponent's poison Pokemon during Pokemon checkup. And though it's not too great, Sneasler, I will at least mention, does have an attack. For Dark and 2 colorless says 90, and your opponent's active is now poisoned. So if you are desperate enough to attack with this, you effectively do 120 damage, and with a Dark Patch and Twin Energy, you can technically attack with this thing, but more than likely, you just want this card sitting on your bench. Because this ability is actually pretty good for decks that do use status conditions. If we think back to the Burbank City Gym Stadium card, that was one of the best stadium cards for its time, even seeing somewhat recent play in the expanded format as well, for this exact sort of effect here. But unlike Burbank, we can actually search out Sneasler with cards like Quick Ball, making this card really easy to get in play for the decks that do want it. Now, of course, that's where things get a little bit complicated for Sneasler, because unfortunately, status condition decks just really haven't been that great. As much as I've really been rooting for cards like Salazzle or the Hisuian Sneasler V to catch on, it just seems like there's always some sort of challenge in the format that they struggle to really overcome. And as far as other pre-Lost Origin Pokemon are concerned, I think one of the only other ones that is somewhat viable is the Galarian Weezing, which actually is a half-decent card, being able to lock your opponent's abilities. One of the issues for Weezing, though, is the fact that its damage output is pretty pitiful, just doing essentially 40 between every turn with poison. But now with Sneasler in the mix, that is a card I think we do at least have to look at a little bit more seriously now. But the big card I think we really want to pair with this is going to be the brand new Hisuian Electrode V. So obviously at the beginning of the set review, I already kind of went over what that whole theoretical archetype is trying to do. And Radiant Hisuian Sneasler actually does kind of fix the math for Electrode. But yet again, the issue here is that Hisuian Electrode V is definitely a little bit of an underdog. And if that's the best partner Radiant Hisuian Sneasler has, things aren't looking that good for it, unfortunately. Like I mentioned earlier in the review, I don't factor expanded into my rating for these cards too much, but I could easily see this card popping up in that format, since we do still have that Hypnotoxic Laser Burbank City Gym combo available to us. But in terms of the standard format, I've got a bad feeling Radiant Hisuian Sneasler here is going to be sitting in your binder until things change a bit for these status condition decks. Next up, we have a brand new Spiritomb. Of course, basic Pokemon, grass weakness, and then a 2 retreat cost. Spiritomb's ability here says if this Pokemon is knocked out by damage from an attack from your opponent's Pokemon, search your deck for a card and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. And its attack here for 2 Dark Energy does 10 plus 60 more for each Spiritomb in your discard pile. Okay, so I think we definitely have some things to like about this card here. This is a fantastic ability. In the early game, that means we can just pitch away these Spiritombs, and in the process, we are building up a bigger damage base for our attack and grabbing the exact cards that we need every turn to help get set up. And because we're grabbing these cards after our opponent attacks leading into our turn, they also can't Marnie us out of these potential cards. And if we just run through the math on this attack, if we have all 4 Spiritomb in the discard pile, we're going to be hitting for 250 damage, which means we are only a choice belt away at that point from being able to take one-shots on all of the most popular Pokemon V-Star. We are going to be a little bit shy of knocking out some of the V-Maxes still lingering around, but luckily Mew is going to be weak to Spiritomb, so that is one we at least can get a one-shot on. And speaking of Dark Pokemon, of course we can use Dark Patch to cheat that extra energy on the Spiritomb. So all of this at sort of a cursory glance makes Spiritomb, I think, really look like a more attractive version of the Magikarp deck, because you're trying to cap out at the same amount of damage, but you don't need as many Pokemon in the discard to hit that same number. But I think this is where things start to get a little bit tricky for Spiritomb, because how are we actually attacking with Spiritomb if we need all 4 of them in the discard at the same time? And of course, that's where the recent Ditto from the Pokemon Go set's going to come into play. We can just chuck away all these Spiritombs, then copy their attacks with Ditto and use that as our main attacker instead. But Ditto has a pretty big issue, and that's the fact that it's not a dark type. So whereas Spiritomb, you can attach a dark energy and dark patch in the same turn and get a fresh attacker out of nowhere, Ditto does not have that same luxury. So if your only Ditto with energy goes down, you need a way to attach a dark energy and cheat an additional one into play. Now, of course, you can choose to play something like EXP Share, and then maybe use like Shopping Center to pick it up and replace it with Choice Belt. That is an option. Admittedly, it's kind of a clunky one. And then we also still have things like Raihan, but whereas with Spiritomb, we just play a couple copies of Dark Patch, call it a day. Now we're carving out a lot more deck space to achieve kind of the same thing. And beyond that, we do have some other options too. Like, I guess if you really want, you can play Galarian Moltres V plus Energy Switch. But now we're starting to play like multi-prizers, and that's kind of getting away from what makes this theoretical one prize archetype so good to begin with. But I just worry with all these cards that you have to play to make up for this second energy attachment you need. This whole Spiritomb Ditto deck is probably no more consistent than the Magikarp deck. And that's kind of a red flag, because the Magikarp deck has kind of flopped up until this point. No pun intended, of course. I really do like this ability and this attack, but right now I just worry there's far too many hoops to jump through to keep chaining these Dittos to copy the attacks of this Spiritomb every turn of the game. I am ultimately going to downvote this card, but this is a card I am holding out hope for. Over the next couple sets, if we do find a more consistent way at powering up these Dittos, I'm definitely going to revisit this card, but for the moment, I'm not expecting a whole lot from it. Next up, guys, we have Drapion VSTAR, but also we have Drapion V as well. Normally, these VSTAR VMAX pre-evolutions aren't too great, but in this case, Drapion V actually kind of makes a case for itself here too. So taking a look at Drapion V first, its ability is really the selling point of this card. It says this Pokemon's attacks cost 1 colorless less for each of your opponent's Single Strike, Rapid Strike, and Fusion Strike Pokemon in play. And then it has an attack, which is normally 4 colorless energy, but hopefully it's just 0 if we're actually using Drapion V. It does 190, and this Pokemon does 60 to 1 of your Pokemon. So I think it's pretty clear what the card designers are hoping for here. If your deck is having a lot of trouble against Mew V Max, slap one of these into your deck. You're just going to nuke a Mew V Max for 0 energy, because they are always trying to max their field out with 6 Fusion Strike Pokemon to ensure they can draw cards with Genesect. So Drapion V just feels like a super hard counter for Mew decks. Though it is kind of weird it's being released now. This definitely would have been a card that would have been more impactful like 6 months ago. But hey, Mew is still a good deck. It's still a force to be reckoned with. But I will say this, I'm actually not even sure if Drapion V necessarily fixes your matchup with Mew if it is a matchup you really struggle with. More than likely, even if you do one-shot their Mew, Drapion V only has 210 HP, which means they're probably going to be able to respond and return KO your Drapion. And at that point, if you don't have an Ordinary Rod plus a Ball Search card to reuse this thing, you still can very easily lose a game. I think a lot of people might just read this card and think, oh, I just auto-win Mew if I play this, but it's not quite that simple. But let's shift gears and look at the V-Star for a minute. So obviously evolving is going to boost you up to 270 HP, fighting weakness still, and a 3 retreat. For 2 dark energy and a colorless is 250 minus 10 for each damage counter on this Pokemon. And then of course does have a V-Star power, and this one says your opponent's active is now poisoned and paralyzed. Put 3 damage counters instead of 1 on that Pokemon during Pokemon checkup. So in a way, this ability kind of reminds me of the one we've seen on the Hisuian Zoroark VSTAR. I think the status conditions are largely going to be irrelevant outside of the actual damage you get from poison, but more than likely, you're just going to be activating this. That way you can get a one-shot with this attack. Because if Drapion is undamaged and you can't find your Choice Belt for whatever reason, you can activate this V-Star power, do 280. That's going to knock out really all of the most relevant Pokemon we have in the format right now. But of course, the big issue here, it's not the attack cost, even though it is a little bit chunky here. It's the fact that it has one of these minus damage attacks, which historically speaking have never really been that good as far as I can recall. Like, I literally can't remember the last Pokemon that had an attack like this that was actually in a viable archetype at any point. So just that precedent alone already makes me very wary of a card like Drapion VSTAR. So if your opponent does use something like a Radiant Greninja or a Cramorant, or just really any attack that can soften up your Drapion before you get going, all of a sudden you kind of lose what makes the card good. Because if this didn't have the minus effect, I would actually say this is a pretty good attack. With a Choice Belt or this V-Star power, you're knocking out all of the best Pokemon in the game right now. But most attacks that are contingent upon what your opponent is doing don't usually pan out to be that good, just because your opponent has control over your own damage output for you. Like, yeah, you can choose to play cards like like Pokemon Center Lady or Hyper Potion, even Potion, but playing a bunch of healing cards is going to make your deck take a hit in terms of its consistency. You would rather use those cards for other draw supporters, tech Pokemon, thicker counts of existing cards you want to play. So I think ultimately I'm going to have to actually pass on Drapion VSTAR. Out of all of the bad Pokemon V we've looked at, I think Drapion's definitely near the top of them. Like, this is better than Aerodactyl. I will die on that hill, absolutely. But when we compare this to the new Giratina VSTAR and Hisuian Zoroark VSTAR that we're getting in this set, along with some of the other dominant Pokemon VSTAR and VMAX that are running around, I just don't think this is on the same power level. Now, it's pre-evolution Drapion V on the other hand. Again, you're probably never building around this, but being able to have a card you can just easily Ultra Ball or Quick Ball out and get a free 3-prize KO on a Mew, I can definitely imagine a world where certain decks out there might choose to play this. So we'll have to see what's ultimately going to happen, but if nothing else, I think both these cards are pretty cool. Definitely some of the more interesting Drapion cards we've had in a long time. Up next from there, we have our final Radiant Pokemon of the set review. That is going to be Radiant Steelix. But Steelix here is going to be a whopping 170 HP basic Pokemon, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, and a 4 Retreat cost. And this is actually one of the few Radiant Pokemon right now that doesn't have an ability. Has 2 attacks. The first one for a Colorless Energy does 20, and you attach up to 2 metal from your discard to this Pokemon. And its second attack for 2 metal and a Colorless does 60, and you discard cards from the top of your deck until you have 1 card left in your deck. This attack does 30 more damage for each energy card discarded in this way. Alright, so let's just get this out of the way real quick. I don't think we're ever using this first attack, even though Steelix is pretty tanky by single prize standards. 170 is not going to save you from most of the Pokemon running around right now. And so I think the idea here is you just like plow through your deck. And in theory, you play so many energy that you can just take big one-hit KOs with Steelix. And because of the damage multiplier for this attack, I think it's actually too low for this to ever be like one of inclusion in like your Origin Dialga decks. I honestly think you probably just have to build around Radiant Steelix, as ridiculous as that sounds, because unlike other decks, you can't have more than 1 Steelix in a deck. And so you're just going to have to make sure you play copies of Hisuian Heavy Ball and like a very heavy Ordinary Rod, Clara sort of count. But before I continue to dunk on this card a little bit more, I will point out we have some good things to talk about. Also in this same set, which we looked at earlier, is going to be the brand new Hisuian Basculegion, which definitely seems like a perfect late game partner to pair up with Steelix here. Because after you blow through your whole deck, you can then pivot into your Hisuian Basculegion, shuffle all that energy that you just discarded back into your deck, and follow your Steelix up with another big one-hit KO. But of course, your opponent can just choose to boss your Basculegion after you Steelix and leave you without like a recovery option. So that's a pain. And then we still have to think about how we're going to even power up Steelix every time we want to use this. So of course, we have Metal Saucer still in the format, but I am curious if Metal Saucer is going to be enough to be able to power up maybe like 4 of these throughout the course of a game. So we might even need some additional help from Raihan or maybe even the Stage 2 Magnezone. I know we're definitely getting into meme territory now, but Magnezone, if you can manage to get one set up, is going to be a really great Pokemon, honestly, for your deck. Because with how many energy you're playing in this theoretical Steelix deck, you're always going to hit enough to power up Steelix with its ability. But guys, do we really want to play a deck where the main attacker can only be played as a one-of? That might have to play a Stage 2 with it? High counts of non-consistency based cards and doesn't really hit anything relevant for weakness? Yeah, I don't really want to either. I mean, hey, I would love to be proven wrong about this, but this just seems like the most inconsistent mess of a deck possible. Like, yeah, I'll probably actually do a video on Steelix at some point just for fun, but there's no part of me that's expecting this to do well at like a regional or anything. It's pretty much here just for the memes. Next up, we have a new Galarian Stunfisk. Of course, going to be a basic metal Pokemon, 100 HP, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, and a 3 Retreat cost. And we're looking at it for its first attack here for a Metal Energy does 20, and if your opponent has a Stadium in play, discard it. If you do, discard 2 energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. So we're really not trying to take big one-shots or anything with Stunfisk here. The 20 damage, in fact, actually doesn't even really make much of a difference. Really, it's the secondary effect here that we would ever consider playing Stunfisk for. And I think it's actually kind of strong, whether it's Path to the Peak, Rose Tower, Training Court. Stadium cards are everywhere in the current format. With a well-timed Stunfisk, you can set them back a few energy, maybe prevent them from attacking or retreating as a result, and of course strip their Stadium card and play that they otherwise would want to stay there. So this actually kind of reminds me of the old Promo Jirachi back from the XY era, but of course that one was more geared towards eliminating special energy. But I think the other big difference that Stunfisk has, it's not quite as splashable. This attack does require metal energies, so we have to to think about what decks out there actually are playing Metal Energy, and there's not too many at the time of recording. Giratina VMAX has to be the most common, and luckily Stunfisk actually does make a little bit of sense there. Since Giraudon's ability walls against a couple of popular decks out there, a lot of decks are going to be trying to keep those Path to the Peak Stadium cards in play to be able to attack into your big VMAX. And Stunfisk here might make a decent one-of ball searchable answer to those Path to the Peak Stadium cards. And I think it's situations like this where Stunfisk really has the most potential. If you're playing it in a deck where it kind of forces your opponent's hand into playing the Stadium card, where they have no other option but to do it, that's where this card can really shine, like in the case of Giratina VMAX, but also maybe even in control archetypes, this might be a good option. Gallermine has been one of the most annoying Stadium cards for the longest time, and is always a Stadium your opponent is very happy to bump out of play because it's going to trap their Pokemon there and they're not going to be able to move. So now as a potential control player, if your opponent does bump your Gallermine, throw down a Stunfisk, discard their counter Stadium along with 2 energy, and now your opponent's kind of back to square one. Like, yeah, your Gallermine's not there, but you eliminated 2 energy, which effectively kind of does the same thing. That being said though, I'm not a super big fan of the Giratina VMAX deck. I always think it's been kind of like a trap, no pun intended, for this card segment here. I think most people confuse it being good with it just being an Arceus deck, and that just kind of makes it not awful by default. Sorry, any Giratina players out there. And then speaking of control decks have really been struggling for a little while now. Stunfisk is definitely going to give them another tool in their toolbox to work with, as well as the new Misfortune Sisters supporter card that's also in this set. But I don't think it's clear yet that control is going to make some sort of big resurgence after Lost Origin. But I still kind of like Galarian Stunfisk, so it's a card I think you should at least have in the back of your mind. Next up, guys, we have Galarian Berserker V. Basic Pokemon, of course. This one only has 200 HP, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, and a 2 Retreat cost. And it has 2 attacks. The first one, just for a Colorless Energy, you draw 3 cards. And its second one, for a Metal and Colorless, does 20 times the amount of cards in your hand. So you can see the synergy between these. You know, in the early game, I think they want you to lead the game with this first attack, draw some cards, expand your hand size, then come in with this second attack on future turns, and hit for big amounts of damage. I think that is the general idea here. And Galarian Berserker definitely has a lot of help out there. Of course, Metal Saucer is going to be able to help us keep chaining these guys throughout the course of a game. We have the Rapid Strike Milotic to prevent cards like Marnie or Roxanne from ruining your day. And we actually do have, I think, a decent number of cards that expand your hand size. So instead of like a Babero or Inteleon engine, I would imagine Cincino probably makes the most sense for this deck. And instead of playing some of these traditional supporters like Marnie or even Research, we'd probably just want to lean a little bit more heavily on supporters that just expand our hand size, like Avery, which also does provide a little bit of disruption along the way, so that is cool. Or maybe even Birdkeeper for a little bit of mobility throughout the game. But as you guys can tell by my rating, that isn't enough to sell me on this card. Unfortunately not. I think one of the big things for Berserker here is that its HP is just far too low. Like if this was 220, I would be more willing to give this card a chance. Because right now, pretty much everything knocks you out. Even Arceus VSTAR can one-shot you, which is kind of sad since that is largely a 2-hit KO-oriented Pokemon. To be fair, we can choose to get around this with cards like Cape of Toughness, which actually might even be a necessity for a deck like this. But if we are choosing to play Cape, that means we're not playing Choice Belt, which we would probably want. And most non-Arceus decks can still take a one-shot on Berserker. I mean, I still think it's a fun card. I think this deck will work. Like, I think you can build a functional Galarian Berserker V deck. It has, like I said, pretty much all the pieces that it really wants. I think just the natural power level of the card, though, is just a bit lower than I would really want. You're going to need 14 cards in hand if you don't have Choice Belt to knock out opposing Pokemon V-Star. And that combined with how low the HP on this thing is, really makes this one a tough sell for me. Alrighty, so after going through all of these other Lost Zone Pokemon, we're finally getting to the big mascot of this whole mechanic and the set. That's going to be Giratina VSTAR. And Giratina V also does have a couple of redeeming qualities of its own. Both Pokemon are going to have no weakness, no resistance, and a 2 retreat, but Giratina's first attack here, you look at the top 4 cards of your deck, put 2 of them into your hand, and put the others into the Lost Zone. And it also has Shred for a Grass, Psychic, and Colorist is 160, and as always with Shred, it's not affected by any effects on your opponent's active Pokemon. If you're going second and your opponent doesn't appear like they're going to put on a lot of pressure, ending your turn with this first attack, honestly not too bad to help get you set up a little bit better. And then of course we also have Shreds that is going to allow our Giratina V to get through some of those annoying wall Pokemon like Miltank if you do happen to go against them. So not a bad pre-evolution, but of course Giratina VSTAR definitely going to be the star of the show here. That HP is going to skyrocket all the way up to 280, so right on par with some of the other legendary V-Stars like Arceus and Palkia. but its first attack for a Grass, Psychic, and Colorless is 280, and then you put 2 energy attached to your Pokemon into the Lost Zone. And its other attack for just a Grass and Psychic, you can only use this if you have 10 or more cards in the Lost Zone, but your opponent's active is now knocked out. So Giratina, this thing just hits like an absolute truck. Just even ignoring the V-Star power being able to take automatic KOs, its first attack dishing out 280 is insane. That's going to one-shot pretty much all of the most relevant Pokemon in the format right now. Like, yeah, we have a couple of VMAXs still lingering in the format a little bit, but if you do need a big VMAX KO, your V-Star power still kind of has you covered. But of course, the big challenge we have with Giratina is the fact that it has these funky energy attack costs. So sort of the obvious way we want to overcome this is going to be with that new Mirage Gate item card I keep referencing throughout the set review. It's pretty much perfect for Giratina since it accelerates multiple different types of energy. And I mean, the card artwork has purple and green on it, for crying out loud. It's pretty clear they want you to play these cards together. So between playing cards like Comfy and the new Colress's Experiment we're going to talk about later, it's really not that hard to get Giratina up and running by turn 2. But if you happen to not be a fan of this whole Lost Zone sort of engine that we have here, I honestly could still see Giratina being played along Arceus V-Star as well. And one of the things I do like about Giratina specifically as a partner for Arceus is that its damage output has never really been great. You're just kind of conceding that you're always going to be taking 2-hit KOs with Arceus. And if you do want to hit certain things for weakness, we've seen cards like Flying Pikachu VMAX, Hisuian Zoroark VSTAR, Crobat VMAX, Galarian Moltres. We've seen all of these other sorts of cards jammed into Arceus decks for these sorts of one-shot options. But now Giratina might just fill that void a little bit easier. Because of the raw high damage output from this card, you don't really care about hitting anything for weakness because you're just taking one-shots on pretty much everything you're going against anyways. And one thing that is cool about Lost Impact, even though it is forcing you to put energy into the Lost Zone, is after you've powered up your Giratina, you can actually just pitch away a double turbo energy you're no longer needing, and that will actually count as 2 energy whenever you send it into the Lost Zone. So in my mind, these are going to be the top ways we can power up Giratina, but there are still a number of other cards I want to throw out there just to get your mind going. Both Grass and Psychic do have other ways at accelerating some energy right now, with cards like Leafeon V or the Celebration Zacian V to maybe get an extra energy attachment on turn 1. But then we do still have other cards like Gardenia's Vigor and also Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX, though that might be a little bit clunkier. So there's going to be no shortage of potential partners for Giratina V-Star here. This card is sick. It takes 1-hit KOs on pretty much anything in the format. The only thing you're not one-shotting are Pokemon VMAX, but with a Choice Belt and a Radiant Hawlucha, you can even fix that. The card has a ton of ways to get powered up, and being a Dragon type means nothing really hits you for weakness, making Giratina kind of a difficult card to tech against. Huge thumbs up for me. Definitely anticipate seeing Giratina at tournaments after Lost Origin drops. Next up, we have the first of 2 new Hisuian Goodra cards. This one's going to be a Stage 2 Pokemon with a kind of mediocre attack, but this ability on Goodra, really cool. You ignore all damage done by your opponent's Pokemon V's attacks to your basic Pokemon that have any metal energy attached. So even though metal hasn't been the most relevant type lately, we still do have a number of decent metal Pokemon in the format still. The different Zacian and Zamazenta Vs definitely have to be at the top of the list, with Zacian V probably being the most proven one over time. A big reason some of these Pokemon have fallen off in the past year is that they aren't one-shotting too many cards out there now, and are also getting one-shotted in return by a lot of decks. And if we can make one of those things not a factor at all with Hisuian Goodra, I could see how that might be worth exploring. And Zacian in particular doesn't seem like the worst partner in the world for Goodra. Since you are a Stage 2, it's naturally going to be a little less consistent getting set up, and having an ability like Intrepid Sword to fall back on in the early game not only might get some energy on your attacker, but might even help draw you into some of those pieces that you need to get your Hisuian Goodra up and running. But I'm still pretty skeptical of this card, guys, because first of all, you do have to have energy on your Pokemon, so that means cards like Crobat V, Lumineon V, or maybe even your next attacker you haven't started powering up yet, can still be bossed up into the active and KO'd. Or if your opponent is playing boss, they could just target down Goodra, which to be fair might force them into some sort of 7-prize game, but the rest of your strategy just kind of crumbles at that point. So I think even though at a quick glance this ability seems really good, your opponent can still play around it, and because Hisuian Goodra is a Stage 2, it's naturally going to be pretty difficult to get these Goodras set up. And then we still have other cards like Canceling Cologne that have been seeing more play, as well as cards like Duraludon VMAX or the new Giratina V that can cut through this with those shred attacks. I just don't think this ability is going to be as disruptive as it might seem on paper. Next up we have another Hisuian Goodra, but this is one I like a good bit more. This is going to be a brand new V-Star. No weakness, which actually is pretty relevant for this particular Goodra. 3 retreat and 270 HP. But Goodra here has one single attack. For a water metal and a colorless does 200, and during your opponent's next turn, this Pokemon takes 80 less damage from attacks. And then for its V-Star power, it has an ability that says heal all damage from this Pokemon. We're not doing a whole lot of damage with Goodra here, but we're basically just trying to keep it alive turn after turn. So as I mentioned, being a dragon type Pokemon is great, even though we don't hit anything for weakness. We also don't get hit for weakness as well. And if we're doing a bare minimum 80 damage reduction every turn, your opponent effectively has to do 350 damage if they want to one-shot a fresh Hisuian Goodra. And that's at the bare minimum, guys. We have plenty of other cards to double down on this whole sort of tanking strategy. We already looked at Radiant Gardevoir in this set review, and then we still have other cards like Big Charm. But it doesn't even stop there. We also have Crystal Cave to heal damage every turn. We have the new Fantina supporter we'll talk about later. That can reduce damage by 120 if we do decide to go with a whole Lost Engine for Goodra. And if your opponent finally does manage to get a good chunk of damage onto your Goodra, we still have this V-Star power to set them back to square one. That's not to say there aren't issues with Goodra though. It is a dragon type Pokemon still, so it is going to have kind of a funky attack cost, and we are going to have to figure out what way we want to overcome that. So up until this point, we could use something like Arceus V-Star. That definitely is a possibility. I can definitely imagine a world where we're playing Arceus V-Star, and then maybe in the mid game, we start using cards like Sharon's Care to get Arceus off the field and just leave these Goodras into play and force our opponent to go through those. We still do have some water energy acceleration in the format as well with cards like Melanie or Frostlass. And because of this multi-energy attack cost, this also could make this another good contender for the whole Lost Engine. I know Goodra doesn't really tie into the Lost Zone mechanic. I could see how people might overlook this as a potential partner. But guys, we have to remember we can use cards like Comfy, Mirage Gate, etc. in any deck. It doesn't have to be with an attacker that makes use of the Lost Zone. But whichever way we choose to power up Goodra, we do have to make sure we do it quickly because we don't want to give up too many free prize cards before we get up and running with our attacker. That's definitely going to be an issue this theoretical deck has. So playing these 2 prize liabilities like Crobat V and Lumineon V might even be out of the question for a deck like this. And another issue that Goodra has is that your opponent can actually still technically play around these damage reducing effects. Because if Goodra does leave the active spot and then is brought back up into the active spot, this damage reduction from this attack is going to go away. So let's say you are going against some sort of Giratina VSTAR deck, and you don't have a Big Charm or a Radiant Gardevoir or something like that, and your opponent plays an Escape Rope, forces your Goodra to the bench, and then plays Boss's Orders and brings it back up to the active spot, well now they can take a one-hit KO. Or a deck like Palkia can go Cross Switcher, then Boss. So you pretty much always need to make sure that you're going to have, whether it's a Big Charm, a Radiant Gardevoir, or maybe even a Diancie in play. That way, when your opponent does go for this Escape Rope or Cross Switcher play, you can promote Diancie and then prevent them from following that up with a Boss onto your Goodra. So I think Goodra, it's a bit of a slower attacker to get up and running. You're not taking these big one-hit KOs. But once you get this card going, your opponent's more than likely going to be 3-shotting these things between your damage reduction, your ability, and all these other tanking options that it has. So I'm still a fan of the card. It's not good in the sort of obvious way that a card like Giratina or Zoroark is, but I think there is enough here to where this could be a solid 2-hit KO oriented tanking deck. Next up, guys, we have our final regular Pokemon V of the set review. That is going to be Pidgeot V. Lightning weakness, fighting resistance, and a 1 treat, clocking with 210 HP with an ability that says, once during your turn, if this Pokemon is on your bench, you may use this ability, shuffle this Pokemon and all cards attached to it into your deck. And then its attack for 3 colorless energy does 80, and if you have a stadium card in play, this does 80 more. Like, yeah, we can power up Pidgeot if we really want to. We still have things like double turbo energy or cards like Arceus, but you're probably only doing 140, 160, maybe a bit more if you have a choice belt. And the ability is just the more mechanically interesting thing we have here. So we've looked at a lot of good abilities throughout the set review, and even though this one isn't good in a very obvious way, there are some cool things I think you can do with this. So I think one of the obvious ones is that you can prevent yourself from decking out. So if you are going at some sort of control deck, or maybe if you are a control deck, you could make use of Pidgeot to make sure your opponent can't force you to deck out. I mean, are we really going to tech for control with Pidgeot V? I don't know about that. Control hasn't been the best in quite some time now. Now, to be fair, we are getting a couple of cards in this set that could help control decks, but currently as it stands, I'm not carving out space for Pidgeot in that sort of instance. Now, the other way we could potentially think about Pidgeot is maybe as some sort of healing card. So even though your opponent's probably not going to attack into Pidgeot, and if they do, they're probably just knocking it out, with the help of the new Thornton supporter that we're going to look at, that can replace one of your basic Pokemon with Pidgeot, we can start doing some kind of gimmicky things. So with cards like the new Damage Pump, or maybe even if you're playing some Psychic deck with the Gengar from, I think it's Sword and Shield, that can move damage counters around, you can then transform this damaged basic Pokemon of choice into Pidgeot, shuffle it back into your deck, and get rid of all the damage on your field. But guys, as you can tell, we are pretty deep in the meme territory at this point. If this ability removed the stipulation that Pidgeot had to be on your bench, this could have been a half-decent pivot Pokemon for in between things getting knocked out. You could promote your Pidgeot V, play a bunch of cards, figure out who you want to attack with for turn, then shuffle it back into your deck, and kind of use it as like an air balloon. Unfortunately, that's not the case, and as a result, we're kind of left with these kind of gimmicky, clunky uses for it, and right now, I'm not expecting them to be worth slotting Pidgeot into your deck. Next up, guys, we have our final Pokemon V-Star of the set review, and we definitely have a great one here to end things on. That's going to be Hisuian Zoroark VSTAR. So the V-Star is definitely going to be the star of the show, but Hisuian Zoroark V isn't awful. It actually does have a 0 energy attack that I think is pretty relevant. You do 30 damage, and you switch this Pokemon with one of your benched Pokemon. It doesn't seem super impactful, but the 30 damage actually can set up knockouts against certain decks out there. And with Diancie still in the format, we can always just choose to switch into that and prevent your opponent from bossing your Zoroark V while you're still waiting to evolve on the next turn. But looking ahead to the V-Star, this is definitely where things heat up a good bit here. Colorless Pokemon VSTAR, 270 HP, Fighting Weakness, 2 Retreat, and it just has 1 attack, and it's a pretty good one at that. For 2 Colorless Energy, does 50 for each of your Pokemon that has any damage counters on it. And then its V-Star power is an ability that says you may use this ability during your turn, you discard your hand, and draw 7 cards. So in a way, I kind of viewed this as like the inverse to a card like Arceus V-Star. Like instead of searching out the exact 2 cards we want out of our deck, we still have an amazing consistency boosting ability, but this one just allows us to see a ton of cards instead. Instead of going for 2-hit KOs, we're going for 1-hit KOs. So definitely some parallels, and we'll have to see which Colorless V-Star cements itself as the best after Lost Origin, but I definitely think Zoroark here deserves to be part of that conversation. This card is absolutely sick. So now, theoretically, in a single turn, you can play a Professor's Research, use Barrel, use Crobat V, and somehow if you still haven't hit what you needed, you now can use your V-Star power to essentially use a second Professor's Research in a single turn. Again, it's kind of like Arceus V-Star in that sense, where if you don't have a great hand, you're just an Ultra Ball away from bailing yourself out of that dead hand, with that card also being your main attacker too. And Zoroark's attack, even though it is a bit combo oriented, I really do like this a lot. If all 6 of our Pokemon in play have damage counters, we're going to be doing 300 damage for just a single double turbo energy, with of course a little bit of a damage reduction down to 280, but that's still insane. That's still one-shotting all of the Pokemon V-Star roaming around right now. And at that point, you're only a Choice Belt and or Radiant Hawlucha away from being able to take one-shots on Pokemon V Max. And by choosing Gapejaw Bog as our stadium card of choice for this deck, we might not even need all of those damage modifiers. Our opponent might just damage their Pokemon for us. But as I just mentioned, Gapejaw Bog is going to be the main way we are trying to get damage counters on our Pokemon. Every time we bench them, we do have to take some damage. And if we do need some damage in a pinch, we of course also have the Gengar that we looked at earlier in the set review that we can get out of our discard pile with damage counters directly on it. So at this point, the only issue we have now is, well, what about Pokemon that were put into play before Gapejaw Bog? And that's where we're going to make use of that new damage pump item that will allow us to move our damage counters around our Pokemon. So again, even though we have to get an entire field full of damaged Pokemon, and that seems kind of clunky at a glance, between the Gengar, the Gapejaw Bog, the Damage Pump, and the insane consistency options that we have access to with Zoroark, it's not that hard to pull this off. And even if fighting Pokemon do see a resurgence as a result of Zoroark, we still have Dunsparce to just eliminate our weakness. If there's anything I could complain about when it comes to this card, is that it is very straightforward. Unlike a card like Arceus V-Star, we're not super versatile. I don't think we have a ton of alternate strategies at our disposal, and we are still damaging our Pokemon at the end of the day, which is something we don't really want to do. But I think that is offset by just the sheer raw damage output and consistency of the Hisuian Zoroark deck. Between this and the new Giratina VSTAR, we are getting some serious one-hit KO machines coming out in this set. And just like with Giratina, I am expecting to see Hisuian Zoroark VSTAR see play as well. And for our last Pokemon of the set review, we have Greedent. So definitely feels a little bit anticlimactic following up Zoroark here. But Greedent, it does have a couple of redeeming qualities to it. Let's check it out. Its first attack for a colorless energy, you just draw 2. Nothing special. We don't really want to use this on a stage 1 Pokemon on the second turn of the game. The second attack, a little bit more interesting. We discard our hand. If we discarded 5 or more cards in this way, this attack does 150 more damage. So 210 damage for just a single attachment on a single prize Pokemon that's relatively easy to get set up. That's not too bad. That, of course, is ignoring the rest of this attack, but on paper, I don't think this seems that awful. And I think a lot of my commentary for Greedent is kind of similar to that of the Hisuian Arcanine. We're all about having to get rid of our hand to do more damage. And I think a lot of the cards we looked at as partners for that deck also apply here too. So cards like Barbarrel or Radiant Venusaur definitely seem like natural partners for this hypothetical Greedent deck. So every time we dump our hand here, on the next turn, we just refill it with Barbarrel and Radiant Venusaur, keep on going. But you guys can probably see the issues with this card coming from a mile away. Yeah, even though we can draw out of this 0-card hand, that's not really the issue. The issue is we have to discard these cards. The other issue is that it has to be 5 cards at least. We have to do this 4 or 5 times per game. Yeah, cards like Ordinary Rod could help us, but there's definitely going to be cards that we're going to have to pitch away in the process that we don't want to. That also could be an issue because we do still need to play cards like Ultra Ball, Quick Ball, etc. to find our Pokemon. And we're naturally going to be playing down our hand just to get more Pokemon and energy into play every turn. And then I think the final issue I have with this card is that it's colorless, which on paper seems okay. That does mean it's flexible in terms of how we want to power it up. But the big thing is we're not hitting anything for weakness and we're really not one-shotting anything. So unlike a card like Hisuian Arcanine, which does 2-hit KO things, it also hits a lot of popular Pokemon for weakness, which Greedent does not. So I think overall, I'm going to have to pass on this card. If it just said discard your hand and there was no requirement to the amount of cards you had to discard, instantly way more excited about this thing. But that combined with the other issues I just outlined means that Greedent's probably not going to be as impactful as it otherwise may have had a chance to be. So looking ahead now to our trainer cards of Lost Origin. Up first we have Arcphone. This is going to be a new item card that says look at the top card of your deck, then return it to the top of your deck. You may choose one of your face down prize cards and switch it with the top card of your deck. So prize cards are one of those aspects of the Pokemon TCG that you really don't have much control over. And as we've seen recently with cards like Hisuian Heavy Ball or even Peonia, being able to have some influence over those cards is definitely a good effect to have. And while I don't think most decks are going to play Arcphone just because it doesn't have a lot of general utility, there's a few cards that we have in the format that this actually does pair pretty well with. One of them is a card that actually has seen a little bit of play, and that's going to be Dream Ball, which of course, whenever you take it from your prizes, allows you to search your prizes for a Pokemon and put it on your bench. We've seen a couple decks make use of this to get Dusknoir out. And between Arcphone and Oranger, we can actually kind of set up these types of plays a little bit easier because we can still use the Primate Wisdom Oranger to put one of these cards we want in our prizes on top of our deck, and then use Arcphone to put that card into our prizes. And another card that we have in the format that's even more fringe and hasn't seen any play at this point is Treasure Energy. I think this finally might be the card that makes Treasure Energy a little bit more playable. Whenever you take it from your prizes, you can immediately attach it to one of your Pokemon. But of course, the issue up until this point is actually drawing it off your prizes whenever you want to. And Arcphone now does finally fix that. But if you guys notice, these are some kind of convoluted, clunky, extremely combo-oriented cards. They're not the most consistent things in the world. And when the best partners for a card is a card that has seen 0 play, and a card that has seen very fringe minimal play, some red flags should probably be going off. That's not to say I don't see any world where Arcphone could catch on. I honestly wouldn't be that surprised if someone proved me wrong here and came up with some really elaborate combo to like cheat stuff out of the prizes with Dream Ball. And who knows, maybe even for decks that have like a multicolorless energy attack cost, maybe we can see like some sort of new engine with Arcphone and Treasure Energy. It could definitely happen, but I just think overall the uses for Arcphone are going to be too narrow and too fringe for the moment to really see play. Next up, we have a brand new supporter. This is going to be Arizu, not exactly sure the pronunciation of this thing, but it's a supporter card that says search your deck for up to 3 evolution Pokemon that don't have a rule box. Reveal them and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So hey, I mean, on the positive side, I love this sort of design philosophy. I love seeing support for single prize cards and single prize decks out there. So I definitely appreciate the attempt. That being said, though, this card is overall, I think, just a little too slow to actually see play. Like, this is 3 times as good as Evolution Incense, so I think it is fair that it's a supporter card. But a lot of these sort of like single prize decks normally need a lot more than just its evolutions. Like, if this did see play in any sort of deck, it would definitely be one where the evolutions are also sort of the draw engine or consistency engine of the deck. So think of decks like Mad Party, where Poltegeist is drawing you cards, or maybe even like the Stage 2 Torterra that is trying to swarm evolutions into play. These are going to be the sorts of decks that would want to look towards this card. You guys may have noticed though, single prize evolution Pokemon just aren't really much of a thing right now. And out of the ones that are sort of near the top in terms of viability, I don't think this particular card fixes the underlying issues those decks are facing. So again, hey, I want to see more support kind of in this vein. I want to see more love for these single prize evolution decks. Those are my bread and butter, but this one just ain't it, Chief. Next up, guys, we have Calamity Case. This is going to be a brand new Pokemon tool card. And it says, if the Pokemon V this card is attached to had full HP and is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack, put 8 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. So this is kind of like the Rocky Helmet tool card, but juiced up on steroids. Now, even though this technically does apply to Pokemon V-Star, V-Max, V-Union, more than likely, we would just kind of be playing this with basic Pokemon V, just because those are the sorts of attackers that are going to get one-shot. And while, as you guys can tell by my rating, I don't have a lot of hope in the partners that we have for this card, I do think there are some cool interactions that we have here. I definitely think the most obnoxious one we have is with Honchkrow V, since it has that ability that allows it to have 4 tool cards attached. In theory, at least, if you throw 4 Calamity Case on Honchkrow, they take a one-shot. They're going to take 320 damage, which is wild. Now, you can only pull this off really like once per game, but nevertheless, it's pretty hilarious. I'm sure someone's going to get a clip of them pulling this nonsense off on PTCGO. But speaking of dark type attackers, I think Sableye is actually maybe one of the more notable cards as well, just because, of course, Sableye does more damage for every damage counter your opponent has on themselves. So if you do throw down Sableye to take a big knockout out of nowhere and your opponent does cobble together a return KO, this can, in theory, set up your next Sableye to come in and finish them off. But the biggest downside to this card might be the fact that your Pokemon has to have full HP. Because if your opponent just benches a Galarian Zigzagoon or uses the quick shooting ability on something like Inteleon, well, this card is pretty useless at that point. And then just in general, it's a passive Pokemon tool card. Like, we don't get benefit out of it on our turn, which gives our opponent a chance to maybe play something like a Tool Scrapper or the new Lost Sweeper, or even just something like a Boss's Orders to get around the Pokemon that has this. So a lot of shock value built into this card, but I don't think this is going to be a very competitive tool. Next up, we have Colress's Experiment, a card I have been referencing throughout the set review. Brand new supporter card that all these Lost Zone sort of decks are going to play. And this one says, look at the top 5 cards of your deck. You get to keep 3 and then put the other 2 into the Lost Zone. So even though we're only keeping 3 of these cards, we're still digging 5 cards deep, which already makes this a bit stronger than some of these other draw 3 supporters that we have in the format. But we're also getting to put cards into the Lost Zone, which of course is going to help out so many of these new cards that we're getting in this set. It's really kind of a race to hit 4 cards, 7 cards, and then 10 cards in your Lost Zone. As soon as you hit 4 cards, you can use Cramorant. At 7, you can use Mirage Gate. And at 10, some of these other cards like Sableye and Fantina will come online and allow you to start using those. So between rotating between multiple Comfies in a turn and using this as our supporter for the first couple turns of the game, we're actually going to be able to see a fair bit of cards. And that's also not factoring in if we're playing other things like Barrel, Crobat V, etc. So Colress's Experiment seems like kind of a weak draw supporter at a glance maybe, but I think it's absolutely going to be at the center of these Lost Zone based decks. Big thumbs up. Next up, we have another card that I have kind of referenced a little bit throughout the set review. That's going to be Damage Pump. This is going to be that brand new item card that I think most notably Hisuian Zoroark is going to be looking to use. But it says you move up to 2 damage counters from one of your Pokemon to your other Pokemon in any way that you like. So if you guys have made it this far into the set review, you know the drill here. We're going to use cards like Gengar or Gapejaw Bog to damage Pokemon, and then use Damage Pump to spread that damage out a little bit more evenly to be able to max out Hisuian Zoroark's damage output. So that's the main use. I don't think I need to spend too much time talking about that, but there are some other cards in the format that I think should think about Damage Pump as well. We of course still have the Single Strike Primate, which is actually very similar to the Hisuian Zoroark. And there's also still some random fire Pokemon in the format that would like this as well. Another single strike Pokemon being Volcanion V, though to be fair, I'm still not a big believer in that card. But a little bit more optimistically, I actually do see a world where maybe we could use this with Radiant Heatran. Radiant Heatran actually can hit for some insane damage, but of course the issue is just getting enough damage counters on it very quickly. But now, thanks to Damage Pump, you can actually take some damage from some of your other Pokemon, move it to Heatran, and now hopefully hit for that magic 280 number. I mean, I guess we can also technically use this as like a pseudo healing card, but that's really not where my intention is for this card. I definitely think the best uses for this are going to be these more aggressive offensive uses. It's not a card that has a lot of like general utility, but it is very strong in these sort of decks that I just outlined. Next up, we have another new card for our Lost Zone toolbox of cards to pick from. This one's going to be Fantina. It's a new supporter card that says you can only play this card if you have 10 or more cards in the Lost Zone. And during your opponent's next turn, your Pokemon take 120 less damage from the attacks of your opponent's Pokemon V. 120 less is certainly changing a one-shot to a two-shot. And we actually have a few new Pokemon from this same set that might have their eye on an effect like this. So even though, yes, we could use this in something like Giratina as maybe like a tech for the mirror match, I'm not super convinced of that use. I think Big Charm kind of accomplishes the same thing in a lot of instances. I think actually the new Hisuian Goodra VSTAR is definitely the more likely partner here, because with Goodra, you're already trying to reduce your damage by 80 every turn with that attack. In the late game, once this card is active, being able to place a minus 200 damage effect on yourself turn after turn, that's really strong. That's going to make it extremely difficult for your opponent to close out a game on your Goodra. That being said though, this is a card I have some reservations about. Obviously, one of the big issues is you do have to have 10 or more cards in the Lost Zone. And if we are playing this with like Goodra as an example, which I think is the most likely partner here, you're not placing energy into the Lost Zone like Giratina. So you're not naturally reaching that 10 card amount as quickly as you probably could have in some of these other Lost Engine based decks out there. And also, this is a card you're probably not playing high counts of. You're probably just playing 1, maybe 2 max in your deck. So finding it on the exact turn that you need it, and also not being forced to pitch it away with cards like Colorless or Comfy is another thing that could be tough to sort of thread the needle on as you're waiting to get to that turn where you want to use this. And of course, playing Fantina means that this is going to be 1 to 2 spots in your deck that aren't consistency cards. They're not cards that are going to help you get set up better. This is definitely like a win more sort of supporter that we have here. That being said though, I'm still going to land a little bit in the middle on this one. I think this amount of damage that we are reducing is too large to ignore, but making use of the card is still a little bit clunky. It might prove to be a little too inconsistent sometimes at least. Next up, guys, we have another new supporter card. This is going to be Iscan? I'm still not sure how you pronounce this thing, but it says draw 2 cards. If your active Pokemon has Hisuian in its name, draw 2 more cards. So this actually kind of reminds me of the old Coach Trainer supporter card that did the same thing for tag teams, which, believe it or not, actually was a card that did see some play in some tag team decks. Normally, these sorts of like draw 2 plus a bonus effect cards aren't that great, but a straight draw 4, that's a decent amount of cards given that you don't have to get rid of the resources in your hand, like with cards like Marnie in Professor's Research. And after this set, we're actually going to have a decent amount of solid Hisuian Pokemon, with obviously Hisuian Zoroark VSTAR kind of leading the charge there. But I think my big issue with this card compared to a card like Coach Trainer is that you're still usually playing a lot of non-Hisuian Pokemon. So unlike the old Gardevoir and Sylveon GX tag team deck that did play Coach Trainer and basically had access to the full 4 cards at any point, a lot of the decks right now aren't going to consistently be able to hit that draw 4 effect. So unless we get some sort of Hisuian Pokemon that functions kind of like the Stonjourner VMAX or Victini VMAX decks where you just play this one evolution line and that's it, and no other support Pokemon, this card probably just won't be good otherwise. Next up, we have actually a reprint of a supporter card that is going to be Lady. This one says search your deck for up to 4 basic energy cards, reveal them and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. Okay, so if we think about this card just on paper, it seems kind of strong. Energy Search is just a single energy card, so this is 4 times as strong as that, and it's kind of fair because this is a supporter instead of just like an item card. And there's actually quite a few Pokemon we have in the format that do want energy in hand. So of course, there's cards like Frostmoth, Cherrim, or the new Finneon that accelerate their energy from hand, or cards like Hisuian Decidueye VSTAR that do more damage when you discard energy. But I'm still not convinced I would actually want to play this in a deck, because between cards like Professor's Research, Training Core, and then any sorts of additional draw effects like Crobat or Barrel, you can probably see the same amount of energy in a turn, if not more, and still be able to draw into other cards that you might need for turn, which is the big issue with Lady, because it is your supporter for turn. If you're playing this, it means you're not playing Professor's Research. It means you're not playing Boss's Orders. I think Lady is a fair card. Like I said, it's literally 4 times as good as Energy Search. So it makes sense that this is a supporter card, but I think this is probably still too slow for my liking. And I'm thinking about just sticking again with normal draw effects and cards like Training Court that we already probably want to play. Up next, we have Lake Acuity, a brand new stadium card that I've kind of referenced a few times in this set review, but it says Pokemon with water or fighting energy attached to them take 20 less damage from the opponent's Pokemon's attacks. So this looks to give a buff to potentially some different tanking archetypes that we might have running around. So some of the decks we could think about here could be like Stonjourner VMAX, or maybe even the new Hisuian Goodra VSTAR. But one thing I do like about this card in terms of how it's worded is that it's not water or fighting Pokemon, it's just Pokemon with water or fighting energy. So that does mean, again, Dragon Pokemon, kind of like Goodra, or maybe some decks that are playing Aurora energy can still make use of this without having to be a water or fighting Pokemon. So that's just another thing I like that makes this card a little bit more flexible. But the big issue with these types of stadiums is that they're very passive effects, meaning that they only come into use on our opponent's turn, which can be bad because that does give them time to potentially bump their stadium with their own or use something like a Pumpkaboo to remove it from play. And stadiums are very popular right now. We are in a very stadium heavy format, and I am a little bit concerned if Lake Acuity will actually stick into play. Then there's also the comparison that I think naturally kind of gets drawn to Crystal Cave, which does serve a very similar purpose. Unlike Lake Acuity, Crystal Cave is a card we can actually choose to activate on our turn to ensure that we can get a benefit from it. Whereas again, Lake Acuity is going to be reliant on your opponent not bumping it from play. And Crystal Cave does heal more damage than Lake Acuity reduces. But that being said, Lake Acuity can still outshine Crystal Cave just because Crystal Cave doesn't prevent your opponent from taking a one-hit KO, which theoretically could be more important if you are one of these decks trying to deny your opponent's one-hit KOs. So you guys can probably tell there is a mix of good and bad when it comes to this card, and as a result, my rating here kind of reflects that. There's a good mix of Pokemon out there that would want to abuse this, but you might have to play like a full 4 count to ensure that you win the Stadium War and that this thing can stay in play to get you that 20 reduction. So we'll have to see where it lands, but it is a card that does have some potential here. So looking at another stadium card, we have Lost City. This one says, when a Pokemon is knocked out, put it into the Lost Zone instead of discarding it. But all non-Pokemon cards attached to that Pokemon are still discarded. So in theory, I do think Lost City makes some sense here because, again, with these Lost Zone cards, we're trying to just race to fill up our Lost Zone as much as possible. And with some of our early game Pokemon like Comfey and Cramorant not having a lot of HP and are easily knocked out, Lost City might be a way to help expedite this process for yourself. Not only that, but there are some annoying things that we can also do with this card. Like if you're going against like the Reggie deck, I think this is probably a good example of how this card can be kind of disruptive. If you knock out 2 of their Reggies while Lost City is in play, well, they can't ever use Regigigas's ability for the rest of the game. Or let's say, hypothetically, that Radiant Steelix we looked at catches on, that becomes a deck. Well, if you knock out their Steelix while Lost City is in play, they can't reuse Steelix and their deck's going to come to a screeching halt. But I'm still not convinced of it. Like I was just saying with the Lake Acuity Stadium we looked at, the big issue with a card like this is the fact that it is so passive and your opponent can just bump it from play. And to top it off, even if it stays in play, I don't think this effect is actually that impactful. In my experience, Giratina VSTAR can use Mirage Gate as early as turn 2 anyways. So what's the benefit you're actually getting by having Lost City in play? Like what Lost Zone card is this activating sooner than you would be able to otherwise? And with a lot of these Lost Zone engines looking to make use of Radiant Greninja, along with playing these different multiple energy types, I think it's going to be a pretty big ask to play this card over something like Training Court instead. I don't think this card's necessarily bad, but it's just kind of a win more card. These Lost Zone decks are going to function just fine without this card, and if anything, it's probably actually hurting your consistency since you won't be using a card like Training Court to get back your energies to fuel your Greninjas or the attacks on your Pokemon. So this one's going to be a pass for me. Up next, we have Lost Sweeper. This one's going to be a brand new item card that says put a card from your hand into the Lost Zone in order to use this card. And then you choose either a Pokemon Tool card or Stadium card in play and put it into the Lost Zone. This gives me similar vibes to the old Field Blower card back from the Sun and Moon era. Now granted, this one's a little bit more limiting. It does have a requirement to be able to use it, and you're only removing 1 tool or Stadium compared to Field Blower's 2, but this effect is still great. Not only can this be annoying to remove your opponent's potentially disruptive stadiums like Path to the Peak or maybe Temple of Sinnoh, but also it's helping your own deck in the process if you are one of these Lost Zone decks, since you are forced to chuck a card away in the process. And we don't even have to necessarily choose our opponent's tools or stadiums. Like let's say we have 6 cards in our Lost Zone and we're so close to activating Mirage Gate. Well, with Lost Sweeper, we can maybe remove an air balloon or a choice belt or something like that from our own Pokemon and send that into the Lost Zone if that means we can activate our energy acceleration at that point. And because we only have to send a single card in our hand into the Lost Zone, this is one of the few like Lost Engine sort of cards that I could see popping up even outside of decks like Giratina. So it even could wind up replacing Tool Scrapper in a lot of decks just because you have that extra flexibility of being able to get rid of a stadium card and not just Pokemon tools. So I'm a huge fan of Lost Sweeper. Even though it's not Field Blower, it's still, I think, a really cool card. I'm really happy to see this one come into the game. And speaking of Lost Zone cards, up next we have, which is debatably the most important of these new Lost Zone trainer cards, that's going to be the new Mirage Gate item card. We can only play this if we have 7 cards or more in the Lost Zone, but we search your deck for up to 2 basic energies of different types and attach them to your Pokemon in any way that you like, then shuffle your deck. The main partner people have been talking about is, of course, Giratina VSTAR. This thing accelerates multiple types. Giratina has a funky attack cost. But I don't want people's imaginations to kind of stop at these Lost Zone Pokemon. I actually think there's a good chance this card will enable a lot of really creative deck building for other non-Lost Zone based cards as well. I think one of the big ones that comes to mind to me is going to be the amazing rare Pokemon. They're pretty powerful cards, but the big issue with them is they have really crazy attack costs that have been, up until this point, really difficult to get going because the best energy acceleration for multiple types of energies until now has been Arceus VSTAR, which of course does not work with non-Pokemon V. So I'll be really curious to dust those off and see how those are going to fare now that we have this thing in the mix. And I think just in general, we need to keep our eyes peeled for any Dragon Pokemon that get printed as long as this card exists in standard format. Because again, Dragon Pokemon, their Achilles heel are those annoying multi-energy attack costs. And now any Dragon Pokemon can slot in some Comfy, some switching cards, some Mirage Gates, and now they have a pretty good engine that gets them set up. So I'm a big fan of this card. It's kind of like the old Beast Ring that we had for Ultra Beast Pokemon back during the Sun and Moon era, which also was an amazing card when it came out. And the 7 cards that you need here in the Lost Zone, I don't think is even that big of a deal. If you're rotating between multiple Comfies and using Colress's Experiment for the first few turns of the game, getting this active as early as turn 2 really shouldn't be that difficult. But big thumbs up for me. Mirage Gate is sick. Definitely is going to see a ton of play, at the very least, in these Lost Zone based decks. Next up, we have Misfortune Sisters, which is a new supporter card that says, look at the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck. You may discard any number of item cards you find there, then your opponent shuffles the other cards you didn't discard back into their deck. So one of the current issues that are facing some of the different control and mill archetypes that we have access to is that they really don't have a way to expedite the mill or control process. Obviously, cards like Durant have their attack, but sometimes you still wind up being maybe a couple turns shy of your opponent decking out. And in the case of more like control-oriented decks that are just trying to lock down their opponents, their issue is that, especially in a best 2 out of 3 situation, they don't really have enough time to play 3 games. And by having a supporter that they can keep looping to maybe deck their opponent out a little bit quicker is something that I do think they would want. But even though this does speed up that milling process, unlike some other milling cards we've had in recent memory like Belba Bryson Men, there's a chance you're just not going to hit anything with the supporter. I mean, unless you're going against like Mew V Max where like 2/3 of their deck is item cards. But that sort of situation aside, if you're only hitting like 1 card with this, that feels pretty low impact. You'd almost rather just use a different supporter at that point. I know I'm being a little bit harsh on this card, but even despite that, I can still imagine this card seeing play. A lot of these control and milling decks aim to sort of trap your opponent in the active with cards like Gather Mine, maybe Yellhorn, and a card like Switch could pretty frequently mess with that whole sort of strategy. So being able to use this card to potentially get rid of cards like Switch, Escape Rope, or Air Balloon could make this debatably just good enough to where you can justify its inclusion in certain decks. It definitely has some challenges to overcome, but Control needs all the help that it can get right now, and these types of archetypes don't really have another card like this in the current format. Next up, we have Panic Mask, a new Pokemon tool card that says prevent all damage done to the Pokemon this card is attached to by the attacks of your opponent's Pokemon with 40 HP or less. This card actually reminds me a good bit of a stadium card we had at the end of the Sun Moon era called Blizzard Town. It did roughly the same thing as this, but it was a stadium card, and that actually did see some play at the World Championship that year in 2019 in a couple of different control decks at the time. So there is some precedent for a card like this to maybe see some play, but it is still a little bit challenging to actually activate. Because I think a lot of time in the current format, especially after Lost Origin, decks are going to fall largely into one of two camps. You're going to have decks like Mew VMAX, Giratina VSTAR, or Hisuian Zoroark VSTAR that aim to take big one-hit KOs. And then the more two-hit KO oriented decks like Arceus are hitting for an amount of damage that's quite a bit shy of a one-shot. Like as an example, if you're using Trinity Nova with Arceus, even without double turbo energy, you're only hitting for 200. And with most VSTARs having 270 or 80 HP, and VMAX is having around 310 to 330, you're really not in the right damage range to activate a card like this. Where I think Panic Mask can shine is the type of attackers that do a pretty sizable amount of damage, but they're in kind of that awkward range where a Choice Belt and or Galarian Zigzagoon doesn't really fix their math all the way. Like Pokemon specifically that hit for around 240 damage. So just as an example, we have the Aerodactyl VSTAR we saw in this set review, but there are still a number of other attackers like this still in the current format too. So if Panic Mask were to see play, I think that would be one of the most common ways we could see this pop up. But I will also point out there are some cool annoying things we can do with this. If you do slap this down on your active Pokemon and you're going against a deck like Mad Party or the new Magikarp deck we got back in the Pokemon Go set, even with full HP, they still only cap out at 40 HP if they're using Bunnelby in the Mad Party deck, or 30 HP if they're attacking with Magikarp. So that could definitely be annoying, though to be fair to those decks, they also have Pokemon with higher HP to still get around this, but you guys get the idea. Overall, it's a fun card, but it's really not what I'm expecting a lot from. Next up, we have a really cool card. This is going to be Thornton. Support a card that says you choose a basic Pokemon in your discard pile, switch it with one of your basic Pokemon in play, any attached cards, damage counters, special conditions, turns in play, and any other effects still remain on that new Pokemon. So for players who have been around in the game for a while, this is very similar to a couple of other cards we've had over the years, with the most recent one being Ninja Boy that we still actually do have access in the expanded format. And much like Ninja Boy, this card enables some really creative deck building. So there's definitely a lot of ways we could take this card, but I'll go over a couple of the ideas that I've been brainstorming for it at least. One category of cards Thornton pairs with are going to be like energy accelerating Pokemon that are kind of limited in terms of the Pokemon they can accelerate to. So think of cards like Regigigas, maybe the Battle Styles Cherim, or even the new Finneon that we saw in this set that have these pretty solid abilities that accelerate energy, but you're limited to the types of Pokemon that you can attach them to. Well, in the case of Thornton, you can power up one of these Pokemon that you're sort of limited to, and then you can use Thornton to switch it into a different Pokemon that would benefit from that acceleration, but normally wouldn't be allowed to make use of it. So for example, maybe in the Regi deck, you can play some of the amazing rare Pokemon just as an example. You're already playing Aurora Energy, so you can just pitch away like an amazing rare Reshiram, Zacian, whatever it might be that you might be thinking about. Then use that Ancient Wisdom ability, power it up with those Aurora Energies, then use Thornton to transform into the actual attacker that you want to. Or to go kind of a different way, let's say your opponent has knocked out like an important tech Pokemon like Manaphy that would normally protect your bench. Well, yeah, you can use something like Ordinary Rod and get it back through that sort of method. But also you can maybe transform one of those bench-sitting liabilities that you have in play, like a Lumineon V or a Crobat V, back into that Pokemon you want to fish back out. And another cool use that I found while I was combing through the card pool was actually with the Mimikyu V that we still have in format, has a really insane ability whenever you bench it from hand. Your opponent actually can't do any damage to it. So obviously put down Mimikyu, it's going to be immune from damage and all that good stuff. Then you transform it into the actual Pokemon that you want. Since Mimikyu V, it's not the best attacker in the world. However, I'm not sure if I'm convinced that any of these are actually going to be like super viable combos that are going to see a lot of play after this card releases. But much like with Ninja Boy, which was a card that only popped up from time to time, it very quickly can create a tempo swing back in your favor with some of these surprise plays that you can make use of. So I think Thornton has a ton of potential, just not sure if it's actually going to be unlocked just yet. Next up, we have Toolbox. This is going to be a new item card that says, look at the top 7 cards of your deck, reveal any number of Pokemon tool cards you find there and put them into your hand, and shuffle the other cards back into your deck. So obviously we have a couple of Pokemon in this set that might like this, those being of course Rotom V and Porygon 2. But we do still have a couple of other Pokemon lingering in the format that I do think should at least consider a card like this. We got the Pachirisu Honchkrow V deck not too long ago that looks to do more damage for every tool card in play. And then we also have the Whimsicott still in format that came out back in Vivid Voltage that discards tool cards from play to do damage. But even though I think Toolbox does make sense in these decks, the issue we have with a card like this is that the type of decks that want this card are already playing so many tools that it makes them inherently less consistent to begin with, and trying to find space for this means you're cutting some of those tool cards that you need, or you're eating into more non-tool cards that might make your deck difficult to get up and running. And at the end of the day, these attackers I've kind of outlined here aren't the greatest. You know, the Whimsicott deck, it was actually kind of good for literally one format. And then Pachirisu, it's okay, but these really aren't the types of cards, right now at least, that are positioned to be winning tournaments and taking down the next regional. And I really don't think Toolbox here is fixing what is sort of causing that. Next up, we have a new supporter card. This is going to be Volo, or Volo? Either way, new supporter card that says, discard one of your bench Pokemon V in all attached cards. So kind of fills actually a similar role as Sharon's Care by sort of denying easy KOs on your Pokemon V, or looking back a little bit further, also kind of similar to cards like AZ or Acerola. But of course, the big difference between these types of cards is that those put those Pokemon back into your hand, whereas Volo is going to be discarding them from play, and that is a little bit worse most of the time. Because there aren't many decks that are going to reward you for having your Pokemon V in the discard pile, you would usually rather get them back into your hand, like in the case of Sharon's Care, to be able to maybe reuse them or reuse some of those cards that were attached to that Pokemon. But I guess we could make the argument that in non-colorless decks, Volo could make a little bit of sense because we can get rid of those bench-sitting liability Pokemon like Crobat V or Lumineon V. They're just sitting there waiting to be an easy 2 prizes for your opponent at some point in the game. Or maybe you're a Pokemon that is trying to wall your opponent with cards like Duraludon VMAX or the new Hisuian Goodra VSTAR. This card could offer you a way to get some of those other non-wall Pokemon off your field and force your opponent to deal with some of these big, giant, tanky Pokemon that you have. But there are so few times when I think you actually not only want to use this card, but also can find a turn to use it. Because again, this is one of those supporters where if we're playing Volo as our supporter for turn, that means we're not playing Research, we're not playing Bossaurs, we're not playing these, quite frankly, better supporter cards that we normally would want to play otherwise. I do think there is still a world where maybe this could pop up, but if this card does see any play, it's going to be extremely fringe at best. Not a big fan of this one. And for our last trainer card of the set review, we have Wind Up Arm. This is a new Pokemon tool that says the Pokemon tool this card is attached to can attack even if it's asleep or paralyzed. So this is definitely a kind of a fringe Pokemon tool card that we have here. The most notable partner, however, of course, is going to be that new Hisuian Electrode V that we just looked at the beginning of the set review. It actually kind of needs this card if it ever wants to really attack, because you're going to be putting yourself to sleep with Parasect. So in a way, this card's success kind of lives or dies based on how good the Hisuian Electrode V is going to be. And I'm still not convinced of that. I like the Hisuian Electrode card. It hits like a truck, attacks for 0 energy, has a lot of extra deck space that most decks don't, but it still has some issues of its own here. And then looking a little bit deeper into the card pool, it doesn't get too much better. I think probably the next best option we have, there is a Galarian Slowbro that hits for more damage if it's affected by a status condition. But beyond that, there's honestly not a whole lot. And with status conditions not being very prevalent in the game right now, this probably isn't even going to be like a good tech card for opposing decks out there. And even if you do want to tech for status conditions, you can just play Switch or Escape Rope and still be able to use a better tool card like Choice Belt. So I'm going to have to downvote this one. Again, if the Hisuian Electrode V does wind up being successful in some capacity, this card will be good as a result. But really, other than that, there's not many reasons to really get excited for this card. And for the last card of the set review today, we have Gift Energy. This is going to be our only special energy of the set. It says, as long as this card is attached to a Pokemon, it provides a colorless energy. But if the Pokemon this card is attached to is knocked out by damage from an opponent's Pokemon's attack, draw until you have 7 cards in your hand. So even within the Sword and Shield block of cards, we've seen other special energies kind of in this vein be successful. I think probably the most notable one is going to be Capture Energy. But of course, the big downside to Gift Energy, you do have to wait until the Pokemon it's attached to also gets knocked out, which does, I think, make it a little bit more limiting than a card like Capture Energy. I actually initially had this card like firmly downvoted, but as I was combing through the card pool, I've kind of changed my mind a little bit on this one. I think one of the main reasons for that is going to be the Regigigas deck in particular. The great thing about this in that context is that you don't really need to run a high count of this. You can probably honestly just run 1, maybe 2 max. And then every time a Regi gets knocked out, you can make Gift Energy one of your energies you're reattaching. It's like a permanent lucky egg for you at that point. But even within this same set, there's also a few partners we could look to. I think most notably, it would be some of these Hisuian Pokemon that have these 0 energy attack costs. The Arcanine specifically also could be a good one because you're playing your hand down to a 0 hand size. So whenever they knock out your Arcanine, you can refill it back up to 7. Or if you want, you can actually throw this down on your barrels. That way, if your opponent tries to boss your draw engine and leave you at a 0 card hand, this almost kind of gives you some insurance to bail you out of those situations too. There are still some ways your opponent can get around this though. Obviously, they can play things like Boss's Orders or Escape Rope and just knock out a different Pokemon. And also, this is only activated when the Pokemon is knocked out by damage. So cards that place damage counters to get KOs, or cards like Giratina VSTAR that has a VSTAR attack that gets a knockout without doing damage, can just bypass this effect altogether. So I don't think this is as good as something like Capture Energy, but I still think there are some reasons to get excited about this thing and still could wind up seeing some play. So that's going to be Lost Origin, guys. I think this is another great set for this whole like VSTAR sub-block of the Sword and Shield era, with definitely the biggest attraction of the set being the reintroduction of the Lost Zone back into the game. But unlike some of the other recent sets, this is one of the few that not only has the mascot of the set being very good, but also there is another very good VSTAR in the set, of course being Hisuian Zoroark, which I think might even rival Giratina roughly in terms of quality. And just looking through the rest of the set too, I think overall we have a pretty good mix of potentially viable single and multi-prize archetypes. But when looking through all of the best cards in the set, outside of Hisuian Zoroark VSTAR, most of the best cards are for these Lost Zone decks. So we're not getting a lot of those universal staple cards like the Barrel, Ultra Ball, or other cards in that vein. And even though we are getting more of these Radiant Pokemon, the ones in this set aren't quite as good as some of the previous ones we've seen. But even with those things aside, Lost Origin I think is a great set. I'm gonna give this set a 4 out of 5 today. But of course, guys, we looked at a lot of cards today, so no doubt my opinions here might differ slightly from yours, so I want to hear your full thoughts down below in the comments section. Do you think I was a little too harsh on any of these cards today? Are there any that you thought I gave a little too much credit to? Let me know your full thoughts down below in the comment section. But either way, I appreciate you guys sticking with me through this long video today. If you did enjoy today's content, just remember to leave a like on the video, or if you're feeling a little bit extra generous, you can also become a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg, or pick up some merch at rarecandytcg.com. Links to everything will be down below in the description. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.